Welcome to StorySeeker, exploring the world, one story at a time. Today, we continue with part 2 of the story Anne of Green Gables. Spring had come again to Avonlea. The snow melted, streams sang through meadows, and Green Gables seemed to breathe a softer, gentler air. Anne, now almost a year at Green Gables, had grown taller, her face less pinched, her eyes brighter with health, yet her imagination wild, radiant, and untamed remained as lively as ever. It was that imagination, as Marilla often warned, that was both a blessing and a snare. For while Anne could make poetry out of shadows and turn common chores into adventures, she could also weave terrors where none existed. One fine afternoon, Diana invited Anne to spend the night at Orchard Slope. They had been apart too much through the winter, and now that Mrs. Barry welcomed Anne warmly, the girls lost no chance of being together. After supper, they settled into Diana's room with books, whispers, and laughter. Outside, the moon rose silver over the budding trees, and a gentle wind rustled the orchard. Diana, practical and a little sleepy, soon drifted towards slumber. But Anne, her mind dancing with images, begged, "Let us tell stories before we sleep. Ghost stories." Diana shivered. "Oh, Anne, must we? You know I scare easily. That is what makes it thrilling," Anne replied, her eyes wide with excitement. The darker the night, the brighter the imagination shines. So she began, spinning tales of haunted woods, phantom horses galloping over the moor, and pale ladies who walked through walls. Her words painted vivid pictures until even she felt a chill. By the time they blew out the lamp, Diana clung nervously to Anne's arm. "You mustn't frighten me so. Promise you'll come with me if I need to go downstairs in the dark." Anne laughed softly. "Of course, bosom friend. I would never abandon you to phantoms." The next evening, after Anne had returned to Green Gables, Marilla asked her to fetch a book from the Barry house. Matthew needed it for some farm accounts. The sun had set. Twilight deepened into a purple dusk. Anne hesitated. The tales of the night before still lingered in her mind, like shadows at the edge of vision. "Do you think I might wait until morning?" she ventured. "Nonsense," said Marilla. "It's only across the lane. The Barrys will leave the book on the table for you. Don't let foolish fancies master you." Ashamed, Anne set off. Yet, as she walked beneath the trees, the night seemed alive. The wind sighed through branches like whispers of unseen beings. The old willow by the brook bent low, its shadow stretching across the path like a giant's arm. Anne's imagination, ever eager, leapt to work. That shadow became a hooded spectre. The rustling leaves were stealthy footsteps. The hollow cry of an owl turned into the wail of a wandering spirit. Her heart thumped wildly. She quickened her pace, clutching her cloak. The Barry house loomed ahead, but even its lights seemed distant, unreachable. At last she burst into the kitchen, pale and trembling. Mrs. Barry looked up in surprise. "Why, Anne, child, you're white as a sheet. What's amiss?" Anne tried to laugh. "Oh, nothing, only I thought I saw something on the path." Diana, who had not forgotten the stories of the previous night, widened her eyes. "A ghost?" she whispered. Anne shuddered. I can't be sure." Mrs. Barry shook her head. "Nonsense. There are no ghosts about here. You young ones let your tongues and your fancies run too far." Book in hand, Anne had no choice but to return. The walk back was worse. Every tree seemed a phantom soldier, every flicker of shadow a lurking spirit. Halfway across the lane, panic seized her. She dropped the book and fled, running as if pursued, never stopping until she burst breathlessly into Green Gables. Marilla, startled by her wild entrance, demanded, "What under heaven is the matter?" Between gasps, Anne confessed, "Oh, Marilla, I saw no. I imagined, but it felt so real. A white thing by the willow, oh, it must have been a ghost." Marilla's lips pressed into a firm line. "Anne Shirley, I told you not to let your imagination get the better of you. There are no such things as ghosts. You frightened yourself into a state over nothing more than a shadow." Anne's cheeks flushed with shame. "I know, but it seemed so dreadfully real. Oh, Marilla, why is imagination both so beautiful and so terrible?" Matthew, who had been listening quietly, laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Well now, Anne, imagination's like fire. It can warm you or burn you, depending on how you use it. Best learn how to keep it in the hearth." Anne, subdued, nodded. "I will try. I do so want to be brave and sensible, but sometimes the world in my head is stronger than the world outside." The next morning, sunlight streamed across Green Gables, golden and kind. Anne went out to gather eggs, and the orchard looked harmless and cheerful, as if it had never held terrors. Birds sang, bees hummed, and the willow cast only a dappled shade. She paused and laughed at herself. How silly I was, to think I nearly lost my wits over a shadow. Marilla is right. I must not let imagination master me. It should serve me, not rule me. Later, recounting the adventure to Diana, she added with a sigh, "It was a dreadful experience, but perhaps I needed it. Now I know that ghosts are not half so frightening as the thoughts we make for ourselves." Diana agreed solemnly. "Still, let's not tell such stories at night anymore. My nerves can't bear it." Anne smiled. "Perhaps we should tell stories of angels instead. They would make the dark beautiful, not dreadful." From then on, Anne tried, though not always successfully, to discipline her imagination. She still spun wonderful tales, but she reminded herself that the moonlight on a path was only moonlight, not a phantom's cloak. It was another lesson in her education at Green Gables, that dreams and fancies must walk hand in hand with reason, or else they lead one into folly. And in her heart, she kept a thought that comforted her. Even when imagination goes wrong, it leaves behind wisdom, and perhaps a story worth telling. Avonlea in early summer was a place of ripening fields and fragrant blossoms. The orchard trees wore crowns of green, and Green Gables itself seemed to glow with life. Anne, now fully at home in her new world, had taken on 100 small duties: feeding hens, helping with butter making, tending flowers, but her restless imagination often sought new adventures in the most ordinary tasks. Marilla, practical as always, preferred things done in a straightforward, sensible fashion. Cooking, she often declared, is no place for flights of fancy. But Anne, though she tried to obey, could never quite resist weaving a thread of imagination even into the kitchen. It happened one warm afternoon. Marilla had gone to visit Mrs. Lynde, leaving Anne to make a cake for tea. She had baked several under Marilla's watchful eye before, and felt confident enough to attempt one alone. "I shall make it perfectly," Anne told herself as she tied on her apron. A cake should be poetry and flour and sugar, a sweet ode to happiness. The kitchen smelled of sunshine and clean wood as she set out bowls, flour, eggs, and sugar. She measured carefully, repeating Marilla's instructions in her head. All went well until she reached the bottle of vanilla flavoring. Anne frowned. The bottle was nearly empty. She shook it, but only a few drops clung stubbornly to the bottom. "Oh dear, how unfortunate," she murmured. A cake without flavoring is like a song without music. Searching the cupboard, she discovered another bottle, nearly full, labeled in tidy letters, anodyne liniment. To Anne's untutored eyes, the liquid inside looked very much like vanilla. A thought darted through her mind. Perhaps it was a different kind of flavoring. After all, why would Marilla keep it in the kitchen if it weren't used for cooking? She hesitated only a moment. Surely this will make the cake distinctive, she decided, pouring a generous spoonful into the batter. It will be an original creation, an Anne Shirley cake. She stirred with great satisfaction, imagining how Marilla would taste it and exclaim, "Anne, this is the most delicious cake I've ever eaten." The cake baked beautifully, golden, fragrant, rising just right. Anne gazed at it in delight. It looks as if a sunbeam had been captured in a pan. By good fortune or misfortune, as it proved, Mrs. Allen, the minister's wife, was expected to tea that very afternoon. Marilla returned just in time to set the table, and when she saw the cake cooling proudly on the counter, she nodded approval. "Well now, that looks fine, Anne. You'll soon be a real help in the kitchen if you keep on like this." Anne glowed with pride. "Oh, I do so want you to be proud of me, Marilla. This cake shall be my masterpiece." When Mrs. Allen arrived, she was all smiles and warmth. Anne adored her instantly. There was something in the minister's wife that drew affection like a magnet. Anne hovered with eager attention, determined to shine in her eyes. The cake was brought in, cut, and served. Anne watched, her heart fluttering like a bird, as Mrs. Allen lifted the first forkful to her lips. The reaction was not what Anne dreamed of. Mrs. Allen's expression froze in surprise, then shifted into polite confusion. She took a second small bite, valiantly trying to conceal her dismay. Marilla noticed at once. "Is something wrong?" she asked sharply. Mrs. Allen hesitated. "Well, it has a very peculiar flavor, rather medicinal, if I may say so." Anne, stricken, tasted a crumb herself and nearly choked. The cake was dreadful, bitter and stinging. Horror swept over her. She leapt up, ran to the cupboard, and snatched the bottle she had used. Reading the label more carefully now, her face went crimson. "Oh, Marilla, it wasn't vanilla at all. It was anodyne liniment." Marilla gasped. "Liniment? Anne Shirley, do you mean to say you flavored a cake with painkiller?" Anne clasped her hands in despair. "Yes, oh yes. I've poisoned Mrs. Allen on her first visit to Green Gables. She'll never forgive me, and I shall be disgraced forever." But Mrs. Allen, though coughing a little, only laughed gently. "Don't worry, my dear. A small spoonful won't harm me, though I must admit, it's the most unusual cake I've ever eaten." Anne's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Mrs. Allen, I wanted so much to please you, and now you'll think me dreadfully careless." Mrs. Allen reached across the table and took her hand. "Not careless, only imaginative. And imagination is no crime, so long as you learn to temper it with care." Marilla, though cross, could not help a small smile at Mrs. Allen's kindness. "You'll have to learn, Anne, that bottles are not all alike. Reading the labels is part of growing sensible." Anne sniffled. "Yes, Marilla. I shall never mistake liniment for vanilla again. But oh, how mortifying to think my first cake for company should be a medicinal disaster." Later, when Mrs. Allen had gone, still smiling kindly, Anne went out into the garden to compose herself. The orchard was heavy with blossoms, bees hummed, and the air was sweet with clover. She sat beneath a tree and sighed. Why must I always make such ridiculous blunders? Other girls are sensible and neat, but I seem doomed to turn every success into a calamity. Matthew came quietly along the path, hands in pockets, his kindly eyes twinkling. Well now, Anne, I heard about the liniment cake, he said. Anne buried her face in her hands. Oh, Matthew, I shall never live it down. Matthew sat beside her. I don't know about that. Mrs. Allen looked mighty pleased to meet you, blunder and all. Folks don't mind a mistake half so much as they mind someone not trying. You've got heart, Anne, and that counts for more than flavouring. Anne lifted her head slowly. Do you really think so? Matthew nodded. Sure do. Just keep on being yourself. You'll get the bacon right in time. Until then, folks'll remember the smile more than the cake. Anne smiled faintly, comforted. Oh, Matthew, you always say just the thing to make me feel better. I shall not despair. Someday, I'll bake a cake worthy of Green Gables and no liniment in sight. That night, writing in her diary, Anne reflected, life is very queer. Disasters seem to pursue me, yet somehow they turn into lessons or even stories worth telling. Perhaps it is all part of the great tapestry of growing up. But oh, how grateful I am for friends who laugh kindly, and for Matthew and Marilla, who teach me patience, even when I test theirs sorely. Someday, I shall be wise, as well as imaginative. Until then, I must tread carefully in the kitchen. And with that resolution, she blew out her lamp, her spirit lighter, her imagination already weaving a brighter tomorrow. Ever since her arrival at Green Gables, Anne Shirley had dreamed of being invited to take tea with one of her school friends. To Anne, such an invitation was the very height of social distinction, proof that she was accepted not merely as a classmate, but as a true companion. So when Diana Barry, glowing with excitement, came running down the lane one afternoon with the news that her mother had given permission for Anne to come to Orchard Slope for tea, Anne could hardly breathe for joy. Me? Truly, me? She gasped, clutching Diana's hands. Oh, Diana, it's the most wonderful honor of my life. I shall be as polite as any princess. Oh, I shall be dignified. Diana laughed, her dark eyes sparkling. Mother says you may come Saturday afternoon. You mustn't be nervous, it will just be us. But you mustn't mind if my little sister Minnie May is noisy. She always is. Oh, I shall adore her, Anne declared. For is she not your sister? And I shall bring all the politeness Green Gables has instilled in me. Oh, Diana, you and I shall remember this tea party forever. Saturday dawned bright and sunny. Anne rose early, braided her red hair with unusual care, and put on her best dress, the brown wincey, with puffed sleeves that Matthew had secretly bought her. Though plain, she carried it with such spirit that even Marilla admitted she looked tidy enough. Anne walked down the lane with her heart fluttering. She rehearsed polite phrases in her head. No sugar, thank you. Or, yes, I would love another biscuit. She longed to behave like the heroines in the books she cherished, graceful and composed. Orchard Slope lay golden in the afternoon sun. Apple trees flanked the path, and the Barry house looked snug and welcoming. Diana met her at the door, her face alight. Anne, you've come. Mrs. Barry received her with stiff courtesy. She was not unkind, but reserved. Anne, determined to impress, curtsied and spoke with studied politeness. Thank you ever so much for inviting me, Mrs. Barry. It is a great privilege. Mrs. Barry looked a little startled, but merely said, "You're welcome, Anne." The girls went into the sitting room, where a small table was spread with neat plates of cake, biscuits, and preserves. There was also a tall, shining bottle of what Anne assumed must be raspberry cordial. "Oh, how elegant," Anne whispered reverently. "Diana, this is the most beautiful feast. It makes me feel like royalty." Diana giggled. "Let's pour some cordial. Mother said we might." Anne, delighted, filled their glasses generously. The ruby liquid sparkled in the sunlight. She lifted her glass with solemn delight. "To our everlasting friendship, Diana Barry." They clinked glasses and drank deeply. The cordial was stronger than Anne expected, very strong in fact. But she assumed that all proper raspberry cordials must taste so. She did not want to seem ignorant, so she said bravely, "How delicious. It warms one's very soul." Diana agreed, and they poured another glass, and another. Soon their laughter grew louder, their cheeks rosier. They sang songs, recited verses, and planned endless adventures. Anne, feeling uncommonly merry, declared that she loved Orchard Slope almost as much as Green Gables. But gradually, Diana grew flushed and unsteady. Her words slurred, and she began to giggle helplessly. Anne, alarmed, tried to steady her. "Diana, dear, perhaps we've had too much raspberry cordial." Before long, Mrs. Barry appeared, stern and shocked. Diana was hiccuping and staggering. Anne, pale with fright, explained that they had only drunk raspberry cordial. Mrs. Barry sniffed the bottle, and her expression changed from severity to outrage. "This is not raspberry cordial. It is currant wine." Anne's heart dropped like a stone. "Wine? Oh, Mrs. Barry, I didn't know. I thought it looked so much like cordial." But Mrs. Barry would hear no excuses. "You have intoxicated my child. Never in all my life, Anne Shirley. You are a wicked, careless girl, and you are no longer welcome in my house." Anne, stricken, tried to plead, but Mrs. Barry ushered her to the door. Diana, too dizzy to understand, merely waved weakly. Anne stumbled back to Green Gables, her spirit crushed. Marilla listened to her sobbing tale with pursed lips. "Well, it was a careless mistake, Anne, but no great crime. You should have asked before pouring. Still, Mrs. Barry is a woman of strong opinions. We'll have to let her temper cool." "Oh, Marilla," Anne wept. "She will never forgive me, and Diana will never be allowed to speak to me again. Our bosom friendship is ruined forever. Oh, it is more tragic than anything Shakespeare ever wrote." Marilla, though stern, felt sorry for her. "Time will tell. You mustn't despair over one mistake." But Anne did despair. At school, she and Diana could no longer sit together. Diana, obedient to her mother, avoided Anne with sorrowful eyes. Anne bore it with dramatic melancholy, writing in her notebook, "Friendship severed is like a rose withered before its bloom." Matthew, seeing her sadness, muttered, "It'll come right. Anne, just wait." It was some weeks later that fate offered Anne a chance at redemption. One evening, Diana's little sister, Minnie May, fell dangerously ill with croup. Mr. and Mrs. Barry were away, and the frightened servant girl ran to Green Gables for help. Marilla was absent, but Anne had learned about croup remedies from Mrs. Hammond, with whom she had once lived. Without hesitation, she ran to Orchard Slope, took charge, and treated Minnie May with hot flannels and doses of ipecac until the child's breathing eased. When Mrs. Barry returned and found her child safe, she burst into tears of gratitude. She embraced Anne. exclaiming, "I was wrong to judge you so harshly. You've saved my Minnie May's life. You must forgive me, Anne Shirley." Anne, overwhelmed, forgave at once. Her heart felt lighter than ever before. Diana flung herself into Anne's arms, crying, "Oh, Anne, we shall never be parted again." And so their friendship was restored, stronger than before, sealed not by raspberry cordial but by courage and love. That night, as Anne knelt by her window, the moonlight soft upon her face, she whispered to the stars, "Perhaps disasters are only hidden blessings. If I had never made that dreadful mistake, I might never have proved my friendship when it truly mattered. Life is very strange, but very beautiful." And in her heart, she knew that even mistakes could blossom into miracles. The weeks after Minnie May's illness were some of the happiest Anne Shirley had ever known. She and Diana were together again, bosom friends reunited. They walked to school arm in arm, whispered secrets under the maples, and dreamed of all the adventures the future might hold. But as every story must, happiness soon made room for a trial, and this time, Anne's fiery spirit led her straight into trouble. At school, the rivalry between Anne and Gilbert Blythe had not cooled. Ever since that fateful day when Gilbert had tugged her braid and called her carrots, Anne had sworn never to speak to him again, and she had kept her vow with the stubbornness of a crusader. Yet Gilbert, whether by mischief or admiration, could not resist trying to catch her eye. He teased, whispered jokes, and excelled in his studies with a determination that matched her own. If Anne read with passion, Gilbert read twice as hard. If Anne spelled flawlessly, Gilbert spelled faster. Their classmates soon took sides, and the schoolroom often seemed more like a battlefield than a place of learning. One crisp afternoon, Mr. Phillips, the teacher, announced a spelling contest. The boys would compete against the girls, and the victors would earn a prize, a new illustrated dictionary. To Anne, it was more than a prize. It was a matter of honor. "We must win, Diana," Anne declared as they walked home. "For womanhood, for Avonlea, and for Green Gables. If the boys defeat us, it will be an insult to every girl in this school." Diana nodded loyally, though she cared more about Anne's excitement than the contest itself. "You'll lead us, Anne. Everyone says you're the best speller." Anne lifted her chin. "I will not fail." The day of the contest dawned bright and full of anticipation. The school buzzed with nervous laughter as the children lined up. Mr. Phillips, seated at his desk, began calling out words. The first rounds were easy. House, garden, river. Everyone spelled correctly. But as the words grew harder, one by one, the children faltered and sat down. Soon, only a handful remained among them. Anne Shirley, standing tall and defiant, and Gilbert Blythe, cool and confident. Their eyes never met, but the air between them crackled. "Erysipelas," said Mr. Phillips. Anne spelled it without hesitation. Gilbert did the same. "Obfuscate." Gilbert's voice rang clear. "Obfuscate. Correct." Anne answered her next word flawlessly. At last, only Anne and Gilbert stood, the rest of the school watching breathlessly. It was no longer boys against girls. It was Anne against Gilbert, red hair against dark curls, pride against pride. "Diana," Anne whispered when the round ended, "I feel as if I were Joan of Arc. This is my battlefield." But fate is often unkind to even the bravest warriors. Mr. Phillips called perseverance. Anne's heart leapt. It was a word she had studied, written, whispered to herself by candlelight. She began confidently, Perseverance. A hush fell. Mr. Phillips shook his head. Incorrect. The second E is an A. Perseverance. Anne's cheeks blazed. Her lips parted in horror. She had lost to Gilbert, who spelled the word correctly and claimed the prize. The room erupted in cheers for Gilbert, but Anne heard nothing except the pounding of her own heart. She felt as though the very walls of the school had betrayed her. At recess, children crowded around Gilbert, praising his victory. Anne, meanwhile, walked out alone, her head high but her spirit wounded. Diana followed, whispering, "Anne, don't be sad. You were wonderful." Anne pressed her hands together dramatically. "Oh, Diana, it is worse than death. To fail at such a word, and before Gilbert Blythe of all people. He will boast of this until his last breath." Yet, to Gilbert's credit, he did not boast. Instead, he approached Anne after school, the dictionary prize under his arm. "Anne," he said quietly, "you spelled splendidly. I was lucky. I'd rather share the prize with you." Anne's eyes flashed. "I will never share anything with you, Gilbert Blythe." She swept past him like a queen dismissing an unworthy knight. Gilbert, watching her go, only smiled faintly. He admired her more than ever. That evening at Green Gables, Marilla listened with a mixture of amusement and exasperation as Anne poured out the tragedy. To be vanquished in such a way, Anne declared, pacing the kitchen, "It will haunt me forever. Oh, Marilla, my honor is ruined." Marilla sniffed. "It's only a school contest, Anne. There'll be plenty more." "But Marilla, you don't understand," Anne insisted, pressing a hand to her chest. This was not merely spelling. It was a duel, a test of courage and intellect. "And I have fallen," Matthew, from his corner, ventured softly. "I thought it was pretty smart of you, Anne, lasting till the end. Gilbert's a clever boy. You'll beat him next time." Anne turned toward him, her eyes glowing with renewed fire. "Yes, Matthew. Next time I shall conquer. I shall study day and night. I shall know every word in the dictionary." Gilbert Blythe may have triumphed. The days that followed found Anne buried in her books, spelling aloud as she walked, as she sewed, even as she set the table. Diana sometimes begged her to rest, but Anne shook her head. "My honor demands it." At school, Gilbert continued to glance her way, but Anne remained steadfastly silent. Their rivalry became the talk of the class, spurring both to new heights of learning. And though Anne suffered deeply from her defeat, she also discovered something important, that failure, though bitter, could sharpen resolve. One evening, as she sat by her window watching the sunset burn across the Avonlea sky, Anne whispered to herself, "Perhaps honor is not in never stumbling, but in rising again with greater strength. If I had won, I might have grown proud, but now I will grow determined. And one day, Gilbert Blythe shall learn that Anne Shirley does not yield forever." Her heart, though still sore, felt steadier. The loss was not the end. It was only another beginning. It was a cold November morning when Miss Stacy gathered her pupils together and announced a new venture. Her eyes sparkled, and her voice carried that same warmth which always stirred excitement in the children. "We shall give a concert," she declared. "A Christmas concert, to raise funds for the library. Every pupil will take part." For a moment, silence reigned. Then whispers spread like ripples in a pond. A concert, songs, recitations, maybe even a tableau or two. The schoolroom had never known such grandeur. Anne's heart leapt at once. She adored poetry. She loved performing. And here was a chance to stand before an audience, to recite words that shimmered like jewels. "Oh, Diana," she whispered fervently as they walked home that day. "Think of it, to wear a white dress, to stand beneath bright lamps, to feel the eyes of Avonlea upon us. It will be almost like being a heroine upon the stage." Diana, more timid, bit her lip. "What if I forget the words? What if people laugh?" "They will not," Anne said earnestly. "We shall rehearse until every line is etched upon our souls. And even if I do tremble, I will imagine myself in another world, perhaps a palace, perhaps a woodland glade, and then I shall not fear." The following weeks were filled with eager preparation. Miss Stacy arranged songs, assigned recitations, and drilled her pupils with patience. The school echoed with verses from Tennyson, Longfellow, and Shakespeare. Anne threw herself into her part with all the energy of her vivid imagination. She was to recite The Maiden's Vow, a piece full of passion and pathos perfect, she thought, for her soul. She practiced before the mirror, before Diana, even before the astonished cows in the Green Gables barn. "And never will I wed," she cried, lifting her hand dramatically, "till love itself shall break my vow." Marilla, overhearing from the doorway, sighed. "Anne Shirley, if you keep waving your arms like that, you'll knock something over. Speak the words plain, and don't look as if you're going to fly through the window." But Matthew, sitting by the stove, watched with quiet pride. "She's got away with it, Marilla," he said softly. "Makes you feel it. Like..." Excitement grew as Christmas drew near. Costumes were stitched, carols practiced, and decorations planned. Avonlea hummed with anticipation, for a concert was a rare delight in the quiet countryside. Families spoke of little else by their firesides. For Anne, the dream of the evening often filled her thoughts more than her lessons. She pictured herself in a snowy white dress, perhaps with a wreath of holly in her hair, standing upon the platform as applause thundered. Diana, in her gentler way, also longed for the moment, but confessed to Anne that her knees quivered whenever she imagined the audience. Anne reassured her, "We shall be like two knights, Diana, going into battle together. Courage shared is courage doubled." At last, the great night arrived. The hall at Avonlea was alight with lamps, their glow casting golden circles upon the frosted windows. Evergreen garlands decked the walls, and rows of eager faces filled the benches. Farmers, mothers, children, everyone had come. Behind the curtain, the pupils clustered, whispering nervously, adjusting ribbons and collars. Anne, though pale, stood tall. Her eyes burned with excitement. "Oh, Diana," she breathed, "this is the supreme moment of my existence. If I succeed tonight, I shall know I was born for the stage. If I fail well, I shall at least fall gloriously." Diana squeezed her hand. The concert began. Songs were sung, tableaux presented, and each child gave their part. When Diana's turn came, she stepped forward, voice trembling at first, then growing stronger as Anne beamed encouragement from the wings. She finished to warm applause and hurried back, cheeks glowing. "You were perfect," Anne whispered. Then came Anne's turn. She walked onto the stage, head high, her white dress shining in the lamplight. A hush fell. She began softly, her voice clear as a bell, rising and falling with the rhythm of the lines. Her gestures, though dramatic, seemed to spring from her very soul. The audience leaned forward, captured. Even stern Mrs. Lynde murmured, "The child has a gift." At the climax, Anne's eyes flashed and her voice rang through the hall. And never will I wed, till love itself shall break my vow. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the room erupted in applause, louder than any that evening. Anne curtsied, cheeks aflame, heart soaring. When it was over, Avonlea was abuzz. People spoke of Anne's recitation all the way home. Marilla received many approving nods and words. "She's a bright one, that girl," Mrs. Barry said, patting her arm. "Full of fire." Marilla tried to appear modest, but her eyes betrayed quiet satisfaction. Matthew, walking beside them, said not a word, but when Anne slipped her hand into his, she felt it tremble. He was proud, deeply proud, though he could never have put it into words. Later that night, as Anne knelt by her window and looked at the winter stars, she whispered, "Oh, how wonderful it is to feel alive, to feel the whole world open before me. If only every day could be like this." She paused, thoughtful. But perhaps if every day were perfect, we should never know how precious such moments are. Her heart, filled with dreams, beat quietly as she drifted into sleep. Dreams not of sorrow, but of the endless possibilities yet to come. Winter settled over Avonlea with its hush of snow and glitter of frost. The orchard slept under white blankets. The brook lay silent beneath ice, and at Green Gables the lamp shone warm against the cold evenings. Anne, flushed from her triumph at the Christmas concert, seemed more radiant than ever. She replayed that night in her imagination 100 times, the glow of the lamps, the rustle of the audience, the ringing applause. But beneath the joy lay one small pang: her dress. It had been plain, neatly made by Marilla, yes, but plain. No puffed sleeves, no frills, none of the lovely details the other girls' gowns had. Diana had worn a pale pink dress, trimmed with lace. Ruby Gillis, always fond of fashion, had flaunted puffed sleeves so large they seemed like balloons. And Anne, though she held her head high, had felt the difference keenly. Still, she told herself, the applause was for me, not the dress. Yet in the quiet of her room she whispered, "Oh, if only I had one gown, just one with puffed sleeves." Matthew Cuthbert, though a man of few words, had noticed. He had sat in the audience that night, his weathered hands folded, his eyes fixed on Anne. He saw how bravely she smiled, how brightly she recited, but he also saw her gaze linger on the other girls' dresses, the wistful look that flickered across her face when she thought no one was watching. Matthew carried that image with him. It stayed as he harnessed the horses, as he forked hay in the barn, as he sat smoking quietly after supper. He loved the child with a tenderness deeper than he could ever express. And now he resolved, in his gentle, stubborn way, that Anne should have a dress with puffed sleeves. But Matthew, though skilled in farming and horse taming, was a timid soul when it came to women's matters. To buy a dress seemed a mountain too steep. Still, one crisp morning, he hitched the sorrel mare and drove into Carmody. His heart beat faster than it did when breaking a colt. He entered Lawson's dry goods store and found himself adrift among shelves of fabrics and counters of ribbons. A brisk young clerk approached. "Can I help you, Mr. Cuthbert?" Matthew stammered, his hat twisting in his hands. I was thinking I might need some hayseed. Maybe." The clerk looked puzzled. "We don't sell hayseed here, sir." Matthew retreated in confusion, muttering something about needing horse rakes, and fled. Back at Green Gables, he felt defeated. But fate, or perhaps the quiet magic of love, came to his aid. For the next time he ventured to Carmody, he encountered Mrs. Lynde. Rachel Lynde, with her sharp tongue and bustling ways, could manage any store, any clerk, any matter of household. "Matthew Cuthbert," she exclaimed, "you look as if you'd lost your way. What brings you to Carmody?" Matthew blushed, but after a moment of awkward shuffling, he confessed in his halting manner, "It's Anne. She's a good girl. Deserves a dress with puffed sleeves." Mrs. Lynde's eyes softened, though she could not resist a smile. Well. So you've taken notice, have you? Leave it to me. I'll see to it she has the finest puffed sleeves Avonlea has ever seen. Relief washed over Matthew like summer rain. He handed her the money, grateful beyond words. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear. Snow sparkled on the firs, and the kitchen at Green Gables smelled of mince pies and spruce. Anne came downstairs, her hair braided neatly, her eyes shining with anticipation for the day. Marilla handed her a parcel. "There's something for you." Mrs. Lynde brought it over. Anne untied the string, lifted the paper, and gasped. Before her lay a dress of soft brown gloria, simple yet beautiful, and, oh wonder of wonders, sleeves puffed like white clouds at sunset. She pressed it to her heart. "Oh, Marilla, is it truly mine? Puffed sleeves. I never dreamed. I never dared hope." Her eyes filled with tears. "It is the loveliest gift ever given to mortal girl." Matthew, standing awkwardly by the door, shifted his boots. "Well, now, thought maybe you'd like it." Anne flew to him, threw her arms about his neck, and kissed his weathered cheek. "Oh, Matthew, you've made me perfectly happy. Perfectly." Matthew's eyes twinkled, though he muttered something about chores waiting in the barn. But his heart glowed all that day. That evening, dressed in her new gown, Anne attended a Christmas gathering. When she entered the room, whispers rose. The puffed sleeves swayed as she walked, and even Ruby Gillis admitted Anne looked quite stylish. Diana clasped her hands. "Oh, Anne, you look like a princess out of a storybook." And Anne, radiant, felt not envy, not longing, but gratitude, deep, tender gratitude for the shy old farmer who had understood the secret desire of her heart. Later, when she knelt by her window, looking at the winter stars, Anne whispered, "How wonderful it is to be loved in such a thoughtful way." Puffed sleeves are not just sleeves, they are Matthew's kindness made visible. And that is a beauty which will never fade. The snow lay quiet over Green Gables, the trees whispered in the wind, and in Anne's heart was a warmth that no winter could ever chill. Spring returned to Avonlea with a soft touch. Snow melted into the earth, the orchards woke with buds, and the brook sang again in the hollow. At Green Gables, Anne seemed to blossom alongside the season. Her thoughts, always overflowing, now poured into new channels. Stories, poems, and dreams that begged to be shared. It was Diana who first suggested it. One golden afternoon, they sat together under the birches by Orchard Slope, a notebook open on Anne's lap. Anne had been reading aloud one of her tragic romances, a tale of a lady in white who wandered forever beside a haunted stream. Diana, caught between delight and bewilderment, at last exclaimed, "Anne Shirley, we really ought to have a club for these stories of yours. It would be such fun." Anne's eyes lit up. "A story club? Oh, Diana, what a perfectly magnificent idea. We could each write tales and read them aloud. We would encourage each other to scale the very heights of imagination." So it was decided. Invitations went out to Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis, who both accepted with enthusiasm. Ruby longed to try her hand at writing something with lots of love in it, while Jane declared she would rather enjoy the adventure of it all. The first meeting was held in the Barry parlor, with its shining brass and tidy curtains. Anne presided solemnly as president. Diana served as secretary, and the others took their roles with much ceremony. They began by reading their compositions. Ruby's was a tale of two lovers who died tragically when their families forbade their marriage. Jane contributed a thrilling account of a shipwreck in which the heroine floated for days on a broken spar. Diana, shy at first, read a sweet romance between a schoolteacher and a soldier. Then came Anne's turn. She unfolded her pages with the reverence of a priest opening scripture. Her story was filled with castles, gallant knights, and a maiden who faded away from sorrow beside a moonlit fountain. When she finished, there was a silence. Ruby dabbed her eyes, Diana sighed, and Jane whispered, "It's just beautiful." Anne's cheeks glowed. "Oh, I am so happy you liked it. Stories are like children, you know. One pours one's very soul into them." From that day forward, the Story Club became their dearest pastime. Each week they met, sometimes in Diana's orchard, sometimes in Jane's parlor, sometimes beneath the willows along the brook. They read, they laughed, they advised one another on plots and characters, but it was Anne who soared highest. Her pen never tired. Her imagination leapt from one wonder to another. Yet even she admitted that sometimes the club produced more laughter than literature. For Jane's practical sense, Ruby's sentiment, and Diana's gentle sweetness often turned their stories into amusing patchworks. One afternoon, Ruby read a tale in which the heroine fainted no less than 5 times within 2 chapters. Anne gravely suggested that 3 fainting fits might be more artistic. Unless, she added thoughtfully, they are absolutely essential to the development of the plot. Ruby agreed to cut 1 fainting fit, though she insisted the others were necessary. Jane, on the other hand, wrote with such briskness that her heroines often forgot to cry when tragedy struck. "Jane," Anne advised, "a proper heroine must weep at least once. Otherwise, how can the reader feel her sorrow?" Jane laughed and promised to try, though she confessed she preferred her heroines to be sensible rather than tearful. Diana's stories, gentle and sentimental, were often the favorites of the club. "I think you'll be a poet one day, Diana," Anne declared earnestly. "Your heart is so tender, and poetry springs from tenderness." One Saturday, Anne proposed a daring experiment. "Let us bury our stories beneath the birch tree," she announced. "We will seal them in a box and dig them up years from now. Imagine the delight of reading them when we are grown women, perhaps married, perhaps famous authors." The others agreed with laughter, and so a little cedar box was filled with their scribbled pages and hidden in the earth. "It will be our treasure," Anne said solemnly, "and the future will judge us kindly." Yet not all went smoothly. There were quarrels over whose turn it was to read first, over whether heroines should always have golden hair, over whether villains might be allowed to repent. But such quarrels ended in laughter, for the club was a bond, a magic circle of girlhood where imagination reigned and friendship deepened. Even Marilla, though she shook her head at the nonsense, could not help smiling when she found Anne scribbling furiously by lamplight. "That child will wear out her pen and her brains together," she muttered, though her eyes were fond. Matthew, for his part, listened quietly when Anne read bits of her tales aloud to him in the kitchen. He never understood half the plots, but he thought the sound of her eager voice the sweetest music in the world. One evening, after the club had dispersed, Anne lingered by her window. The moon silvered the orchard, and the brook murmured below. She thought of the stories they had written, of the laughter and dreams they shared. "How wonderful it is," she whispered, "to create a world with words, to live 100 lives in imagination. Even if none of us ever becomes famous, we shall always have these stories, woven together with our friendship. That, I think, is the best kind of immortality." She pressed her notebook to her heart. Outside, the blossoms stirred in the night air, and Green Gables itself seemed to breathe with the promise of spring. The June sun poured its golden warmth over Avonlea, setting the fields aglow and the orchards humming with bees. Anne, walking down the lane with Diana, felt that summer was like a poem written just for her. Every flower seemed to open its petals to greet her imagination, and every breeze carried whispers of new adventures. But Anne's delight was soon distracted by a matter closer to vanity than poetry. For the Avonlea Sunday School was planning a grand picnic at the beach, the most exciting event of the year. The thought of it thrilled every child in the district. Delicious food, games on the sand, and, most importantly, the opportunity to wear one's finest dress. Anne, however, had only her plain gingham frock, the same one she wore each week. It was neat, it was serviceable, but it was not what she imagined for such a splendid occasion. In her dreams, she saw herself in a gown of delicate muslin, adorned with puffed sleeves that floated like clouds at her shoulders. "Oh, Diana," she sighed as they lingered by the birch trees. "How I long for a dress with puffed sleeves. They are the most romantic fashion ever invented. One feels positively angelic in them. But Marilla thinks them foolish frills and says I must be content with plain sleeves forever." Diana, who adored Anne's imagination but had no trouble accepting her own simpler wardrobe, tried to console her. "Your gingham looks very nice, Anne. And besides, you'll forget all about sleeves when you taste the strawberry ice cream." Anne shook her head. "Ice cream may soothe the palate, Diana, but puffed sleeves soothe the soul." As the picnic drew nearer, Anne's longing grew sharper. She even dreamed one night that she arrived at the beach in her gingham frock, only to have every eye fixed in pity upon her, while the other girls floated by like visions in their puffed-sleeved splendor. She awoke in tears, convinced that her plain dress would forever chain her to obscurity. Marilla, though she said little, noticed the wistful looks and overheard the sighs, yet she remained firm. "Foolishness," she told Matthew. "Girls must learn not to set their hearts on frippery." Matthew, however, saw more than Marilla guessed. One evening he watched Anne bend over her schoolbooks, her thin shoulders stooped, her face bright but shadowed with a yearning he could not ignore. Matthew had never bought a girl's dress in his life, but he resolved then and there that Anne should have puffed sleeves if he had to drive to Carmody himself to find them. The day came when Matthew slipped away to the dry goods store. Shy as ever, he stood before the counter while Mr. Samuel Lawson, brisk and talkative, asked what he required. Matthew fumbled. He asked first about hayseed, then about garden tools, and finally, after much throat clearing, blurted something about a dress for a young girl. Mr. Lawson, with cheerful efficiency, pulled down bolt after bolt of fabric brown, blue, grey, none of which Matthew dared to choose. His tongue grew thicker by the moment, until at last he fled the store with nothing but a bag of sugar, leaving the astonished clerk staring after him. But Matthew was not one to give up when Anne's happiness was at stake. That evening, he confided his trouble to Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Rachel, practical and sharp-eyed, laughed heartily at his awkward attempt, yet her heart softened. "Leave it to me, Matthew," she said. "I'll see that Anne has a dress fit for a queen." The Sunday school picnic dawned clear and radiant. Anne awoke early, her heart thudding with anticipation. She dressed carefully in her old gingham, smoothing it as best she could. Just as she was fastening the last button, Marilla entered with a bundle in her arms. "Here, child," she said gruffly. "This is for you." Rachel Lynde made it up, with Matthew's help. "Put it on and be quick." Anne unwrapped the bundle and gasped. A dress of pale green muslin lay before her, soft as a meadow breeze, and at the shoulders, oh glory, puffed sleeves, round and full, like blossoms about to open. For a moment Anne could not speak. She pressed the fabric to her cheek, her eyes shining with tears. "Oh, Marilla, it's the loveliest thing in the world. I feel as if I might faint for joy." "Don't be foolish," Marilla muttered, though her own eyes softened. "Get it on before we're late." At the picnic, Anne walked among her classmates in her new dress, and every head turned. Ruby Gillis whispered that Anne looked just like a princess, and Jane Andrews declared she had never seen such sleeves outside a fashion magazine. Anne herself moved as though on air, her imagination soaring higher with every compliment. The day was filled with games, laughter, and baskets of food so delicious that Anne thought she might never eat again without disappointment. But the crowning delight came when Mrs. Allen, the minister's wife, complimented her gown. "What a becoming dress, Anne. You must thank Matthew for it." Anne's heart swelled. She did thank him later that evening, throwing her arms around his neck in a burst of gratitude. Matthew, embarrassed but deeply pleased, only murmured, "Glad you like it, Anne. Glad you like it." Yet, amid the joy, Anne felt a strange tug within her. The puffed sleeves, though beautiful, were not the true source of her happiness. As she looked around at Diana's smile, at Matthew's quiet kindness, at Marilla's stern but loving face, she realized that love itself was the garment she wore most splendidly. That night, sitting by her window with the moonlight silvering the garden, Anne whispered, "Vanity may vex the spirit, but kindness clothes the soul. Oh, how rich I am, richer than queens, for I have friends who love me, sleeves or no sleeves." The summer deepened, filling Avonlea with sunshine and the hum of bees. Anne delighted in the long golden days, when the lake of shining waters gleamed like polished silver under the sky. Yet, as much as she loved her studies and her visits with Diana, she longed for adventure, something dramatic, something that would satisfy her yearning for romance. One afternoon, as the girls gathered under the willows near the brook, Anne brought out a well-worn volume of poetry. She read aloud with all the passion of her dramatic spirit, her voice trembling with emotion as she recited the ballad of the Lady of Shalott. "Oh, isn't it the most tragical tale?" she cried, her eyes shining. "To drift down the river in a barge, singing one's last song, pale and beautiful, while the nights gaze in sorrow, it is poetry made flesh. Oh, how I wish we could act it out." Diana's eyes widened. "You mean you would pretend to be the Lady of Shalott?" "Exactly," Anne declared. "I shall lie in a boat, robed in white, and float down the stream. You and the others can stand on the bridge and watch me pass, mourning my untimely fate. It will be the height of romance." Ruby Gillis giggled nervously, while Jane Andrews looked doubtful. "But Anne, what if you fall out of the boat?" Anne waved aside their fears. "Poetry demands courage. And besides, I can swim a little. Nothing dreadful could possibly happen." Preparations began at once. Diana supplied a length of white cloth to serve as Anne's shroud, and Ruby contributed a bouquet of lilies. They borrowed a small flat-bottomed boat from the Barry farm, tying it loosely to the bank, while Anne arranged herself within it. She looked every inch the tragic heroine, her face pale with excitement, her red hair spilling like fire against the white cloth. The lilies clasped upon her breast. "Now," she whispered, "let the Lady of Shalott drift to her doom." The knot was loosed, and the boat slid into the current. Slowly, it drifted beneath the drooping branches, the girls following along the bank, half frightened, half enchanted. Anne raised her eyes to the sky and began reciting lines of poetry, her voice echoing across the water. But romance has a way of turning to mishap. Halfway down the stream, the boat caught against a sunken log. For a moment it trembled, then tilted sharply. Water rushed in. Anne gasped. "Oh, mercy!" she cried. "It's sinking!" The girls shrieked from the shore, running to and fro in panic. The boat lurched again, and Anne, clutching her lilies, was thrown into the water with a splash. For one terrifying instant she went under. Then she rose, struggling, her white draperies clinging and dragging at her limbs. She tried to swim, but the fabric weighed her down. "Help!" she called. "Oh, help!" It seemed the end of her adventure had turned all too real. But just as her strength began to fail, a strong hand grasped her arm. She was hauled toward the bank, coughing and sputtering, her hair plastered to her face. When she looked up, half drowned and wholly humiliated, she found herself staring into the astonished eyes of Gilbert Blythe. Gilbert had been fishing along the shore when he saw the commotion. Without hesitation, he had leapt into the water to rescue her. Now he stood over her, dripping wet himself, but with a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Well, Anne Shirley," he said, "it seems you've been playing tragic heroine again. If I hadn't been here, your Lady of Shalott might have ended at the bottom of the brook." Creation. Anne's pride flared, even as gratitude burned within her. "I was acting out a scene of immortal beauty," she retorted, shivering. "It is not my fault the boat betrayed me." Gilbert laughed, a warm, teasing sound that made her cheeks flame hotter than the sun. "Immortal beauty or no, you'd best get home before you catch your death. Come, I'll see you safely back." Anne stiffened. "I require no escort, thank you." She gathered her sodden skirts with as much dignity as she could manage, though they dripped heavily around her ankles. Gilbert, undeterred, walked beside her anyway, carrying the bouquet of bedraggled lilies. "At least let me bring these. They seem to have fared better than you." Anne said nothing, but her lips pressed into a thin line. She was furious at being rescued by Gilbert Blythe. Gilbert, of all people. It seemed to her that fate had chosen the cruelest of ironies. By the time she reached Green Gables, Anne was thoroughly chilled. Her adventure turned into vexation. Marilla met her at the door, aghast at the dripping spectacle. "Child, what in heaven's name?" "It was only a little accident," Anne confessed meekly. "We were acting out the Lady of Shalott, and the boat sank." Marilla's eyes flashed. "A little accident? You might have drowned. And you'd better thank Providence that Gilbert Blythe was there, for I doubt your poetry would have saved you." Anne flushed scarlet. "I would rather have drowned than be beholden to Gilbert Blythe." Matthew, who had been listening in the corner, chuckled softly. Now, Anne girl, pride's a poor thing to cling to when a body's been pulled from the water. Better to be grateful, I'd say." Anne sighed, half ashamed, half stubborn still. "Perhaps, but I shall never speak to Gilbert Blythe again, as long as I live." That night, as she sat by her window brushing out her long hair, Anne replayed the day's events in her mind. The memory of Gilbert's steady hand, his quick action, and that maddening smile would not leave her. She admitted, if only to herself, that he had been brave and kind, but her pride was stronger than her gratitude. To thank him properly seemed impossible. Instead, she whispered to the stars, "O Lady of Shalott, you died tragically, but at least you were not rescued by your worst enemy." Yet even as she spoke, a tiny voice inside her wondered whether Gilbert Blythe was truly her enemy, or perhaps something far more complicated. The next day at school, Gilbert said nothing about the rescue. He only gave Anne a brief, knowing glance, which she returned with icy disdain. Still, there was something in his eyes, half amusement, half respect, that stirred a strange flutter in her heart. Anne turned quickly away. She resolved never again to let vanity carry her into such peril. But deep down, she could not help but admit that life, with all its mishaps and humiliations, was sometimes more thrilling than the most romantic poem. That evening, Anne confided to Diana, "I have learned one thing, dearest friend. When one attempts to live in poetry, the prose of life often interferes most rudely. Perhaps it is best to keep one's adventures safely in the imagination." Diana, who had been badly frightened by the whole affair, nodded fervently. "Oh, Anne, promise me you'll never do anything so dangerous again." Anne clasped her hand solemnly. "I promise. I shall be content with daydreams." But still, wasn't it tragically romantic? Just for a little while. And so the unfortunate Lily Maid became another tale in Anne's growing collection of adventures. One that made the girls shiver with delight when retold, and one that made Marilla shake her head with exasperation. But for Anne herself, it left a quiet lesson that pride and vanity could lead one into deep waters, and that sometimes being rescued even by one's rival was not the worst fate in the world. Autumn drifted gently into Avonlea. The maples blazed scarlet, the birches glowed gold, and the fields, after harvest, lay quiet under the soft haze of Indian summer. For Anne, it was a season of change, one of endings and of new beginnings. School had resumed, and with it came fresh challenges. Anne, determined as ever, threw herself into her studies with all the intensity of her eager mind. Yet beneath her diligence pulsed a deeper excitement, for this was the year she would sit for the entrance examinations to Queen's Academy. The thought of higher learning, of walking proudly through the great halls of education, filled her heart with fire. Diana often watched her with admiration. "Anne, I don't see how you remember all those things," she said one evening as they studied together. "History, algebra, Latin verbs, it makes my head spin, but you seem to love it." Anne smiled, her eyes shining. "It isn't just learning facts, Diana. It's reaching for something beyond ourselves. When I study, it feels as though I'm climbing a hill, and each lesson brings me closer to the top, where the view must be glorious. Oh, to stand there and see the world spread out before me, that is what I long for." Still, ambition brought with it rivalry, for Gilbert Blythe too was preparing for Queen's, and the competition between them had become the unspoken thread of every lesson. Anne would never admit it aloud, but Gilbert's quick mind drove her onward. Whenever he excelled in class, Anne's pride flared, and she bent over her books with renewed determination. One crisp October afternoon, the teacher announced the annual Avery Scholarship, a prize awarded to the best student in the province, covering the full cost of Queen's Academy. The words fell upon the class like a spark into dry grass. Anne's heart thudded. A scholarship. It meant more than honor. It meant the possibility of lifting the burden of expense from Marilla and Matthew's shoulders. She looked across the room and met Gilbert's eyes. He, too, had understood. Their gazes locked for an instant, fierce and unyielding. Then Anne turned back to her desk with a flush of resolve. At Green Gables, the news stirred quiet conversations. Marilla, who always spoke with plain sense, said, "You must work hard, Anne, but don't fret yourself into a fever. Ambition's well enough in its place, but health is better." Matthew, in his gentle way, only smiled and patted her hand. "I always knew you'd do well, Anne girl. Just keep at it steady like. I'll be proud of you, no matter what comes." Those words, so simple, gave Anne a strength deeper than any prize could offer. She resolved that she would do her very best, not only for herself, but for these two, who had given her a home and love beyond measure. The winter that followed was a season of toil and triumph. Day after day, Anne rose early, studied late, and poured her whole heart into her lessons. Her notebooks filled with neat lines of Latin translations, her essays brimmed with vivid imagination, and her arithmetic grew swift and sure. Sometimes she grew weary, but she never faltered. There were moments, too, of laughter and joy. Diana remained her dearest companion, always ready with a word of encouragement or a shared walk under the frosted stars. Even the rivalry with Gilbert took on a curious sweetness. Though Anne still held her grudge in name, in truth she began to respect the steady light in his eyes, the quiet determination that matched her own. Spring came, tender and green, and with it, the days of the examinations. The students from Avonlea and surrounding villages gathered, their hearts full of hope and dread. Anne walked into the hall with her head high, though her hands trembled slightly. Each paper was a mountain to climb, yet as the days passed, she felt the summit drawing nearer. When the final test was finished, she walked out into the sunlight, weary but exultant. "I have done my best," she whispered to herself. "And perhaps it will be enough." The weeks of waiting that followed were almost harder than the examinations themselves. Each morning Anne scanned the post with beating heart. Each evening she dreamed of triumph or of failure. Then, one golden June day, the news arrived. Anne was in the orchard when Diana came flying up the path. Her cheeks flushed, a paper clutched in her hand. Anne, the results, they've come. You've passed, you're at the very top. And Gilbert too, he's second." For a moment, Anne could not move. The world seemed to whirl about her in a dazzle of blossoms and sunshine. Then she laughed, half laughing, half crying, as she threw her arms around Diana. "Oh, Diana, it's too wonderful. To think that Anne Shirley, once the orphan nobody wanted, have passed at the top of the list. And Matthew and Marilla, oh, how glad they'll be." She flew back to Green Gables with the news. Matthew listened with quiet pride, his eyes shining like stars. Marilla's lips twitched in a rare smile, though she scolded gently. "Well, it's what I expected of you, Anne. But mind, pride goes before a fall, so keep your head." But later that night, as Anne passed by Marilla's room, she heard her whisper softly, "Thank the Lord, I was right to take the child." For Anne, this triumph marked more than the end of a school year. It was indeed an epoch in her life, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. She stood at the threshold of the wider world, with dreams stretching before her like a road across the hills. Yet, as she gazed out from her window that evening, watching the fireflies dance over the meadows, she felt not only ambition but also gratitude. "All that I am," she whispered. I owe to Green Gables, to Marilla's stern love, to Matthew's gentle faith, to Diana's friendship. Whatever heights I may climb, my heart will always belong here. Have wantest, and in the quiet of that summer night, Anne Shirley, once the lonely orphan, felt herself anchored at last, rooted in love, reaching toward the stars. The long summer days slipped by like golden threads woven into a tapestry of memory. Avonlea basked in sunlight, the fields heavy with promise, the orchards rich with fruit. For Anne, each morning dawned with a thrum of anticipation, for soon she would leave the quiet rhythms of Green Gables and step into a wider world, the world of Queen's Academy. The results of the entrance exams had already sealed her future, but now came the true beginning. Letters were sent, timetables arranged, and the Queen's class for Avonlea District was formally organized. It meant that Anne, Gilbert, Jane, Ruby, Charlie Sloane, and several others would all be preparing together for the great year ahead in Charlottetown. Anne could hardly keep still for excitement. Only think of it, Diana, she said one afternoon as they sat beneath the apple trees. In just a few weeks I shall be walking the halls of Queen's, with real professors, real libraries, and hundreds of students who all love learning as much as I do. I feel as though I am standing on the edge of a great adventure. Diana, though happy for her friend, sighed. I shall miss you terribly, Anne. The thought of you gone from Avonlea makes everything seem empty. Who will walk with me down Lover's Lane or whisper secrets in the twilight? Anne reached over and squeezed her hand. You will always be my bosom friend, Diana. No matter where I go, a part of my heart will remain here with you and with Green Gables. But we mustn't let sorrow dim the joy of what lies ahead. This is the doorway to our futures. When the first gathering of the Queen's class took place, it was in the schoolhouse, with the desks polished and the air full of energy. The students clustered in groups, chattering about the year to come. Gilbert stood tall among them, his easy smile winning laughter from Ruby Gillis and Jane Andrews. Anne, resolute as ever in her silent rivalry, kept her head high and her eyes steady. If Gilbert noticed her determination, he gave no sign, but a flicker of amusement danced in his eyes. The teacher, Mr. Phillips, addressed them solemnly. This is a serious undertaking. The Queen's Academy class demands diligence and perseverance. Many of you will be tested as never before, but I expect you all to uphold the honor of Avonlea. His words hung in the air, but in Anne's mind they only fanned the flame of resolve. She felt the challenge stir her very soul. This was no longer the simple reciting of lessons in a village classroom. This was a race to prove herself worthy of the wider world. The weeks that followed brimmed with preparation. Anne spent long hours with her books, her desk by the east gable window covered in neat piles of notes. She reviewed Latin declensions, wrestled with algebra, and composed essays that sparkled with imagination. Sometimes, when her brain grew tired, she would lean out the window and let her eyes wander across the fields, gathering strength from the beauty of Avonlea. Matthew would often pause in his chores to look up at her window. "She's a real smart one," he would murmur to himself with quiet pride. Bound to do us credit at Queen's. Marilla, though more reserved, secretly glowed with satisfaction. She watched Anne's concentration, her graceful growth into young womanhood, and thought, how strange that we ever thought we wanted a boy. This girl is worth 10 of them. Yet, for all her ambition, Anne did not lose her joy in the world around her. She still found time to wander through the haunted wood with Diana, to gather wildflowers along the brook, or to stand on the ridge at sunset and let her imagination paint castles in the glowing clouds. One evening, as the two friends lingered on the bridge, Diana said softly, "Anne, when you go to Queen's, you must promise not to forget me." Anne's eyes grew luminous. "Forget you, Diana Barry. Never. Bosom friends are for life. We are like two souls twined together, and though distance may separate us, the bond will never break. Why? When I walk beneath the elms of Queen's, I shall think of you walking here in Avonlea, and my heart will be comforted." Diana smiled, though tears glimmered in her eyes. As the date of departure drew near, Avonlea buzzed with talk. Neighbours stopped Anne on the road to wish her well, proud that one of their own would be representing the village at Queen's. Even Mrs. Lind, with her sharp tongue, said approvingly, "Well, I always knew that if any of our young folks was to distinguish themselves, it would be you, Anne Shirley. Just remember to keep your feet on the ground and your head out of the clouds." Anne laughed and promised, though in truth she had no intention of abandoning her dreams. For she believed with all her heart that the clouds and the earth belonged together, that imagination and practicality, woven rightly, made life beautiful. At last, the great day came. The Queen's class assembled once more, this time to make final plans for the journey to Charlottetown. They would board the train together, a small band of students carrying the hopes of their families and the pride of Avonlea. As Anne stood among them, her heart swelled. She looked at Gilbert, at Jane, at Ruby and Charlie, and thought, "We are setting out upon the same road, though each of us will walk it differently. Who knows what lies ahead? Success, failure, friendship, rivalry, perhaps even love." She felt the thrill of destiny about her, as though the very air shimmered with promise. That evening, back at Green Gables, Anne packed her modest trunk. She folded her few dresses carefully, placed her books with reverence, and tucked a spray of dried blossoms between the pages of her diary. Marilla stood in the doorway, watching. Her face was calm, but her eyes were thoughtful. "Anne, you're going out into the world now. You'll meet people of all kinds, and you'll have choices to make. See that you keep your conscience clear and your ideals high. Don't let vanity or pride spoil you." Anne turned, her eyes luminous. "I will remember, Marilla. Green Gables has taught me more than books ever could. Whatever I become, it will be because of the love and guidance I found here." Matthew, standing behind, cleared his throat softly. "We're proud of you, Anne girl. Always will be." For a moment, Anne could not speak. She went to them both and laid her hands gently in theirs. "I'll try to be worthy," she whispered. When she went to bed that night, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind in the apple trees. A strange mingling of joy and sadness filled her heart. She thought of her childhood days, of the girl who had first arrived at Green Gables with nothing but dreams, and of the young woman she was becoming, standing at the threshold of a new life. "I'm glad I belong to Avonlea," she thought. "No matter where I go, this will always be my home. And tomorrow, I begin a new chapter." And so the Queen's class was organized, not merely on paper, but in spirit, a band of eager hearts ready to step into the wide, waiting world. September came with a rustle of leaves and a tang of autumn in the air. The fields of Avonlea glowed with ripening grain, and the maples along the lanes blazed with scarlet fire. It was a season of endings and beginnings, the old year slipping away, and for Anne and her classmates, a new chapter unfolding. The Queen's class gathered in the schoolhouse for the last time before setting out for Charlottetown. Their trunks were packed, their hearts fluttering with anticipation. Yet amid the excitement, there was a hush too, for each knew that this moment marked the close of one life and the beginning of another. Anne lingered by the window, gazing out at the familiar landscape. The brook that wound through the meadow sparkled in the sunlight, whispering its eternal song. Beyond it, the great river stretched broad and shining, flowing steadily to the sea. She thought of how she herself was like that brook, running joyfully among the fields of childhood, yet now ready to merge into the wider current of life. "Anne, are you dreaming again?" Diana teased gently, coming to stand beside her. Anne smiled. "I was thinking how the brook meets the river, just as our childhood meets the future. Isn't it beautiful, Diana, how nature speaks to us in parables?" Diana's eyes grew soft. "It is beautiful. But oh, Anne, I can't bear to think of you leaving. Who will share my secrets or walk with me through the haunted wood?" Anne slipped an arm around her friend. "We shall always belong to each other, Diana. No river can wash away the memory of a brook. And though I must go to Queen's, part of me will remain here, under these skies, on these paths." The farewell gatherings began. Neighbours dropped by Green Gables to wish Anne well, each with their own words of advice. Mrs. Lind urged her to keep her wits about her and not be carried away by high notions. Mr. Barry offered a solemn handshake. The smaller children of Avonlea crowded around her, their eyes wide with admiration. At Green Gables, the air was full of tender unease. Marilla, though outwardly composed, kept finding reasons to linger near Anne, to smooth a dress, to remind her of some practical matter. Matthew, quieter than usual, often sat watching her with a wistful smile, as if engraving every line of her face into memory. On the last evening before her departure, they sat together on the porch, the twilight deepening into purple shadows. The air smelled of ripe apples and the distant sea. "Anne girl," Matthew said softly, "you mind to keep true to yourself. There'll be smart folks at Queen's, smarter than most, but don't let that daunt you. You've got the best gift of all, a kind heart." Anne's eyes filled with tears. "I'll remember, Matthew. I'll try to live up to Green Gables and all you've given me." Marilla cleared her throat, her tone brisk, though her voice trembled. "You'll do us proud if you simply do your duty and keep a level head. That's all any of us can ask." Anne kissed them both and whispered, "I'll make you glad. I promise." The journey to Charlottetown was full of wonder. Anne, Jane, Ruby, Charlie, and Gilbert traveled together, their chatter filling the train car. The landscape flew past villages, woods, wide stretches of sea sparkling in the sun. Each mile carried them farther from Avonlea and deeper into the unknown. In Charlottetown, the Queen's Academy loomed grand and imposing. Its red brick walls, tall windows, and leafy grounds seemed like a palace to Anne's dazzled eyes. Students streamed about in their smart attire, books under their arms, laughter ringing through the corridors. "This is the world I've dreamed of," Anne thought, her heart racing. "A place where learning is the very air we breathe." The first weeks were both thrilling and exhausting. Classes demanded sharp attention and endless study. Anne threw herself into the work with eager passion, her imagination finding delight even in the dry pages of Latin grammar. Jane and Ruby shared her excitement, though Ruby often sighed over the handsome faces of certain male students. Charlie Sloane struggled gamely, while Gilbert, steady and brilliant, quickly earned the admiration of teachers. Anne could not deny a certain pride and irritation that Gilbert remained her closest rival. Their scores in every subject ran neck and neck. And yet, despite her resolve never to forgive him for that long-ago insult, she found herself respecting his diligence, even admiring the generosity with which he sometimes explained a problem to others. The girls boarded together in a comfortable house near the academy. Their evenings were filled with study, but also with laughter, whispered secrets, and plans for the future. Sometimes, Anne would pause amid her books to gaze out the window at the stars above Charlottetown and whisper, "How far I've come from that orphan asylum. How wonderful the world can be when dreams come true." Yet even in her happiness, she never forgot Avonlea. Letters flew back and forth between Green Gables and Queens. She poured her heart into them, describing her classes, her friends, the beauty of the city, always signing them with gratitude and love. Matthew treasured each word, reading them again and again by the lamplight. Marilla, though less demonstrative, would sometimes be caught slipping a letter into her apron pocket, keeping it near as she went about her work. As the term wore on, Anne grew in both knowledge and spirit. The competition grew fiercer, the exams harder, but so too did her determination. She studied late into the night, her lamp casting a golden glow on her books, her imagination turning even the driest facts into living stories. There were moments of homesickness, of course moments when she longed for the quiet fields of Avonlea, for Diana's companionship, for Matthew's gentle presence. At such times, she would walk beneath the trees on campus and remind herself, this is the river. To reach the sea, the brook must flow onward, and always there was Gilbert. Their rivalry sharpened them both, driving each to greater effort. Sometimes their eyes met across the classroom, a silent acknowledgement, almost friendly, of the race they ran together. Anne would look away quickly, her cheeks warm, unwilling to admit even to herself how much his presence meant. By spring, the brook of her childhood had indeed merged with the river of life. Anne stood taller, her mind enriched, her heart deepened. She knew that she was no longer the little girl who had once arrived at Green Gables in a plain wincey dress. She was a young woman now, her future wide as the horizon. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, she wrote in her diary, "I see now that life is like a journey from brook to river, from smallness to greatness, from dreaming to doing. The brook is sweet, but the river carries us forward. And yet, though I flow on, I shall never forget the meadow where my brook began." The days of spring slipped into June, and with them came a breathless anticipation. At Queen's Academy, students whispered of nothing but examinations and results. The air inside the classrooms grew tense, heavy with chalk dust and ambition. Even the lilacs blooming in Charlottetown seemed to nod knowingly, as though they too awaited the verdict. Anne felt it most keenly. She poured herself into her books, sometimes studying until the first pale light of dawn edged the horizon. Latin declensions, algebraic puzzles, essays in English literature, all filled her waking hours. Yet behind her diligence there was a pulse of excitement, a dream shining steady, the dream of passing, perhaps even with honours. Diana's letters from Avonlea grew anxious and tender. "Do not work yourself sick, dear Anne," she wrote. "Remember that whether you win or lose, you are my bosom friend forever." Matthew's letters were simpler, but filled with quiet faith. "You'll make us proud, Anne girl," he wrote in his sprawling hand. And Marilla, though she rarely wrote more than a page, always ended with, "Be steady, do your duty, we believe in you." Those words wrapped around Anne like a cloak. She carried them into every examination hall. The week of exams arrived, morning after morning, The students filed into the large hall of Queens, their footsteps echoing, their hearts hammering. The long desks gleamed. The papers waited like unopened secrets. The hush was broken only by the scratch of pens and the nervous rustle of pages. Anne sat with her head bent, her red hair catching the light like a flame. She wrote with clarity, her imagination lending color even to facts and formulas. When doubt whispered, she thought of Matthew's smile, of Marilla's steady eyes, of Diana's unwavering friendship, and somehow, strength returned to her hand. Gilbert Blythe, across the aisle, worked with equal determination. Their rivalry remained unspoken, yet keen. Each glance at the other's bent head spurred them to greater effort. In those hours, they were not enemies, nor quite friends rather, two spirits racing toward the same bright summit. By the end of the week, the exhaustion was almost unbearable. Students stumbled from the hall, pale and weary, yet relieved. Anne leaned against a pillar, laughing with Jane and Ruby, though her hands still trembled. "It is over," she whispered. "Over, and the world is beautiful again." But the waiting was not. The results would not be posted for weeks. The days dragged, long and restless. Anne walked the leafy streets of Charlottetown, gazing at the shop windows without seeing them. She tried to read novels, but her mind slipped back to exam questions. At night, she dreamed of lists, of names written in bold letters. Always, she woke with her heart racing. Letters from Avonlea urged patience. "The brook must wait for the river," Matthew wrote. Diana confessed that she prayed nightly for Anne's success. Even Mrs. Lind sent a note, filled with advice and a surprising warmth. "You've got the brains for it, Anne," she said. "Just don't let fancy run away with you." At last, one bright morning in July, word flew through Charlottetown like wildfire. The pass list is out. Students raced through the streets, their footsteps pounding. Anne, Jane, Ruby, and a dozen others hurried together, breathless with suspense. They reached the academy gates, where a crowd already pressed close around the bulletin board. The paper was posted, the names written in neat black letters. For a moment, Anne's vision blurred. She clutched Diana's hand. Then she saw her name, Anne Shirley, passed with honors. The world seemed to tilt and glow. She laughed, half in disbelief, half in joy. Beside her, Jane cried out with delight she too had passed. Ruby clapped her hands, radiant. And then came the final shock. At the very top of the list, marked for the Avery Scholarship, were two names tied: Gilbert Blythe, Anne Shirley. For an instant, Anne's heart stopped. Then it leapt, fierce and proud. She had done it. She and Gilbert together stood first. The rejoicing was wild. Students embraced, wept, sang. Some, who had failed, wept in sorrow, yet even their tears could not dim the triumph of others. Anne walked home through streets alive with celebration, her spirits soaring. Every tree, every cloud seemed touched with magic. That evening, letters flew back to Avonlea. To Diana, she wrote, "Dearest bosom friend, I have passed and with honors. I am tied for first with Gilbert Blythe. Isn't it wonderful? I can scarcely believe it. Yet in my heart, I always hoped and prayed." To Matthew and Marilla, she wrote more simply, "I have passed, and I hope you are glad. I thought of you both in every hour of trial. This is your triumph as much as mine." Back at Green Gables, the news brought a stir of joy. Matthew read the letter aloud, his voice trembling with pride. "Our Anne girl," he murmured. "First at Queen's." He wiped his glasses with shaking hands. Marilla listened in silence, though her lips quivered. At last she said, "Well, I always knew she had it in her, if only she could keep her head out of the clouds. But I am glad. Yes, I am very glad." In the kitchen, Mrs. Lynde declared it a great feather in Avonlea's cap, while Diana hugged the letter to her heart. When Anne returned for the summer holidays, she was greeted as a heroine. Children followed her along the lane, eyes wide with admiration. Neighbors stopped her to shake her hand. Yet, through it all, Anne remained humble, her heart full of gratitude. On a quiet evening, she walked to the brook behind Green Gables, where the water laughed among the stones. She sat on the bank, watching it flow, and thought of the journey from brook to river. "I have passed," she whispered to the rippling water, "but the journey has only begun. There is more to learn, more to dream, more to do." She lifted her face to the twilight sky, glowing with rose and gold, and in that moment, she felt the future opening before her, vast, shining, full of promise. The summer sun of Avonlea was golden and generous, spreading warmth over the fields and orchards. Life at Green Gables had settled into a gentle rhythm. After the storm of examinations and the joy of triumph, Anne cherished each day of quiet work and sweet companionship. Yet summer in Avonlea was never without its moments of excitement. And one such moment came when an invitation arrived from the White Sands Hotel. The Grand Hotel, standing proudly by the sea, was a place of elegance and fashion. Families from the city filled its rooms each summer, bringing with them silks, jewels, and manners quite unlike the simple folk of Avonlea. Yet now, the hotel had planned an evening concert, and the young people of the village were invited to perform. When Anne heard the news, her heart leapt. She and Diana had often dreamed of the splendor of the White Sands Hotel, to not only see it, but to sing upon its stage that was a vision almost too dazzling to bear. The preparations began at once. Diana was to sing a duet with Anne, their voices blending in sweet harmony. Ruby Gillis, always eager to shine, practiced a sentimental ballad. Jane Andrews was to play a piano piece, while several others rehearsed recitations. Even Mrs. Lynde approved, though she remarked with her usual bluntness, "Mind you, Anne Shirley, don't let your head swell up. Remember you're representing Avonlea, not fairyland." Anne laughed, but she felt the weight of responsibility. "If we must represent Avonlea, we shall do it beautifully," she declared. "Oh, Diana, can't you imagine the chandeliers, the shining floor, the ladies in gowns like blossoms?" Diana smiled, though her cheeks glowed with nervousness. "I only hope I won't forget the words," she confessed. At last, the evening arrived. The girls dressed at Green Gables, their laughter mingling with the rustle of ribbons and lace. Anne wore a simple white dress. Marilla had helped her fashion. It was not grand, but in its very simplicity, it made her look like a lily, fresh and radiant. Diana, in pale pink, was like a blush of dawn. Matthew watched them from the doorway, his eyes shining with pride. Though he said little, Marilla adjusted Anne's sash with brisk hands but a tender glance. "Mind you, behave with dignity," she warned, "and don't let your imagination run away with you." Anne kissed her cheek. "Oh, Marilla, I'll try to be both dignified and poetic at once." The White Sands Hotel stood resplendent by the shore, its windows glowing with light, music drifting through its open doors. The girls entered the great hall, their hearts racing. It was everything Anne had imagined and more. The chandeliers sparkled like constellations. The polished floor reflected silks and satins, and the air was filled with the fragrance of roses. "Isn't it like a scene from a storybook?" Anne whispered to Diana. But before Diana could reply, the performance began. One by one, the young people of Avonlea stepped forward. Ruby sang with great flourish, her curls bouncing. Jane played with careful precision. The audience of city ladies and gentlemen smiled politely, though now and then Anne thought she detected a touch of amusement in their eyes, as though they found the village performers quaint. Then came Anne and Diana's turn. The two friends walked to the stage, their hands trembling slightly. Anne lifted her chin, her eyes shining. The first notes of the piano sounded, and their voices rose together. Clear, sweet, and true, the duet floated through the hall. Anne's voice in particular, rich with feeling, seemed to weave a spell. She sang not only the notes, but the dream of Avonlea. The wind in the trees, the ripple of the brook, tenderness of friendship. The audience grew still, leaning forward, caught by the sincerity of her song. When the last note faded, there was a moment of silence, and then a burst of applause. The city folk clapped warmly, some even exclaiming, "Charming and delightful." Diana's cheeks glowed with relief, and Anne's eyes shone with joy. Later in the evening, Anne was called again, this time to recite. She had chosen a poem full of passion and imagery, one she had rehearsed countless times beneath the apple trees of Green Gables. Standing tall upon the stage, her face lit by the chandeliers, she spoke each word with fire. The verses flowed from her lips like music, painting pictures so vivid that even the most sophisticated listener could not help but be moved. When she finished, the applause was louder than before. Anne bowed, her heart swelling. For a moment, she felt as though she had stepped into a dream where beauty and praise were hers to command. But dreams, however bright, must fade. As the concert ended and the young people of Avonlea mingled among the city guests, Anne overheard whispers. "Such a pretty girl," one lady said, though rather countrified. "A pity she hasn't proper training," murmured another. "Still, a natural talent." The words stung, though Anne tried not to show it. She smiled and accepted compliments, but deep inside she felt a small ache. No matter how brightly she had shone, she was still, in their eyes, a girl from a little village. On the carriage ride home, Ruby and Jane chattered about the grandeur of the evening. Diana sighed with happiness, but Anne sat quietly, gazing at the stars above the sea. At Green Gables, Marilla awaited them. "Well?" she asked. "Oh, Marilla, it was splendid," Anne burst out, her eyes alight once more. "The lights, the music, the applause. I felt as if I were part of some enchanted world. And yet," she paused. "And yet," Marilla pressed. Anne smiled softly. "And yet, I think the sweetest applause of all is Matthew's quiet smile, and Diana's hand in mine, and the thought that Avonlea is proud of us. Perhaps the world can call us simple, but there is a kind of greatness in simplicity, don't you think?" Marilla looked at her steadily, then gave a small nod. "There's sense in that. It's not what the world says, Anne girl, but what you are." Anne went to bed that night with the sea breeze drifting through her window, carrying memories of chandeliers and roses. Yet in her dreams, it was not the glittering hotel she saw, but the shining brook, the green fields, and the faces of those who truly loved her. For she understood, more deeply than ever, that splendor fades, but friendship and home are treasures that last. The summer rolled swiftly by, golden and fragrant, until September came with its crisp mornings and the first hint of scarlet in the maples. For Anne Shirley, the season carried a bittersweet note, for it meant leaving Green Gables for the great adventure of Queen's Academy. Ever since the results of the entrance examinations had been published, her name, standing high among the first Anne's world, had been filled with congratulations, plans, and dreams. Avonlea was proud of her. Marilla was quietly satisfied, and Matthew's heart was almost too full for words. Anne herself, however, felt a curious blend of joy and wistfulness. She loved Green Gables with every fiber of her being. To leave it, even for a year, felt like tearing away a piece of her soul. Yet the lure of knowledge, the promise of new friendships, and the thrill of proving herself were irresistible. In the weeks before her departure, Anne spent every possible moment wandering the familiar haunts. She and Diana took long walks through the haunted wood, now less frightening but still full of mystery. They lingered by the lake of shining waters, whose ripples seemed to whisper farewell. Anne visited the old orchard, the schoolhouse, the violet-sprinkled lanes. Each place held memories, bright and dear. One evening, she and Diana sat on the front steps of Orchard Slope, watching the twilight settle over the fields. Diana sighed. "Oh, Anne, it won't be the same without you. Who will I tell my secrets to? Who will I walk with to Sunday school? Everything will feel empty." Anne's eyes glistened, but she tried to smile. "We'll write letters, dearest. Long, thrilling letters, filled with every detail of our lives. You'll tell me all about Avonlea, and I shall tell you of Charlottetown, of my studies, of the girls at Queen's. It will be almost as if we were together." Diana leaned her head against Anne's shoulder. "Promise me you won't forget me, even if you make splendid new friends." "Forget you?" Anne exclaimed softly. "Oh, Diana, kindred spirits are not forgotten. You are woven into the very fabric of my heart." Marilla and Matthew prepared quietly for her going. Marilla sewed sturdy new dresses, plain but well made, and packed her trunk with careful thought. Matthew, though he said little, insisted that Anne should have something finer, a new winter coat of soft brown material, lined and trimmed. Anne girls got to look respectable among the city folk, he muttered, and his rough hands fumbled with nervous eagerness as he gave the order to the store. When the coat arrived, Anne was enchanted. "It's the loveliest thing I've ever owned," she cried, twirling before the mirror. "Oh, Matthew, you always give me just what I most wish for, sometimes even before I know I'm wishing for it." Matthew only smiled, his eyes tender, though his lips trembled a little. The day of departure dawned bright and clear. The orchards blazed with autumn color, as if nature herself had decked the world for farewell. Anne rose early, her heart fluttering with excitement and sadness. She dressed carefully, tied her ribbons, and looked around her room with a pang. Every corner held a story: the cracked slate, the little window that framed sunsets, the books lined neatly on the shelf. Downstairs, Marilla was brisk, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. Breakfast was eaten almost in silence. Then the carriage was brought around, and the trunk strapped on. Diana came running, flushed and breathless, to see Anne off. The two girls clung to each other, laughing and crying all at once. "Oh, Anne, I'll miss you dreadfully," Diana sobbed. "And I you," Anne whispered. "But think, each day apart brings us one day closer to reunion." At last, they parted, and Anne climbed into the carriage beside Matthew. The drive to the station was quiet. Matthew held the reins, his gaze fixed on the road, while Anne looked out at the fields rolling by. She thought of the little red-headed orphan who had come down this very road years ago, full of wild dreams and fears. How far she had come since then. At the station, Marilla's composure nearly broke. She hugged Anne briefly, then said gruffly, "Now don't be foolish at Queen's, Anne. Study hard and behave properly." Anne kissed her cheek. "I'll make you proud, Marilla. You've done so much for me, I'll never forget it." Then the whistle blew, the train puffed, and Anne was swept away. From the window, she waved until Green Gables, and the faces she loved faded from sight. The journey to Charlottetown was long, but Anne's spirits rose as the landscape changed. She saw bustling towns, winding rivers, and finally, the broad streets of the capital. And then Queen's Academy itself, with its stone walls, tall windows, and air of scholarship. Anne felt a thrill of awe. This was the place where her dreams would take flight. The girls from across the island gathered, tired, eager, nervous. There were familiar faces, Gilbert Blythe, of course, with his confident smile, Jane Andrews, sensible and cheerful, Ruby Gillis, fluttering and excited. And there were new girls too, from towns Anne had only read about. Anne soon found herself sharing a room with 3 others. Priscilla Grant, a gentle and witty girl who quickly became a true friend. Philippa Gordon, dazzling and lively, whose laughter filled every corner. And Stella Maynard, quiet and thoughtful. They welcomed Anne warmly, and she felt at once that this new chapter would be rich with friendship. Life at Queen's settled into rhythm: early rising, long classes, late nights of study. The work was hard, but Anne loved it. Her mind drank in knowledge like a thirsty flower. Mathematics challenged her, literature inspired her, and history unfolded like a grand tale. She and Gilbert found themselves often in the same classes, sometimes rivals, sometimes allies. Though Anne still held her old resentment deep down, she could not deny a grudging admiration for his quick wit and steady excellence. He, for his part, treated her with easy respect, as though their childish quarrel had long been forgiven. The days flew by. Anne wrote long letters to Diana, full of descriptions of the bustling city, of the grand classrooms, of the girls' late-night talks. Diana's replies were treasures, keeping Anne rooted to Avonlea even as she soared into new worlds. One evening, as autumn winds rattled the windows, Anne sat at her desk and looked over her books. Her heart swelled with a sense of belonging. She was no longer the awkward child who had once arrived at Green Gables by mistake. She was a Queen's girl, now studious, ambitious, and filled with dreams. She whispered to herself, "I'll do great things, not for fame, not for glory, but because life is meant to be lived fully. And whatever happens, I'll always carry Avonlea in my heart." At Green Gables, Marilla and Matthew sat by the fire, speaking little but thinking much. The house felt quieter without Anne's chatter, but it also glowed with pride. Their Anne girl was becoming a woman, one step at a time. And so the chapter closed. Anne Shirley, once the lonely orphan of the asylum, was now a student at Queen's Academy. She had crossed a threshold into a wider world, yet she remained Anne dreamer, worker, and heart full of love. She was, at last, a Queen's girl. The golden leaves of autumn soon gave way to the bare branches of November. Frost crept into the mornings, and the air grew sharp and clear. For Anne Shirley, her first winter at Queen's Academy opened like a book filled with challenges, discoveries, and 1,000 new impressions. At first, the city seemed strange to her, a place of noise and crowds, so different from the quiet lanes of Avonlea. But as the weeks slipped by, Anne grew accustomed to the rhythm of Charlottetown life. The streets were lined with glowing shop windows, carriages clattered along cobblestones, and church bells chimed on Sundays. Everywhere there was motion, laughter, and learning. At Queen's, the work deepened. Each day was filled with study algebra, literature, philosophy, Latin, and composition. To Anne, these subjects were more than dry lessons. They were living adventures. She walked into history as though it were a story told by a fireside. She lost herself in poetry until her heart beat to the rhythm of the verses. Even mathematics, though a stubborn adversary, became a puzzle she longed to solve. But study was not the only life of Queen's. There were societies and debates, concerts and skating parties, evenings when the young people gathered to read aloud or share songs. Anne, with her bright imagination and glowing spirit, soon found her place among them. Her roommates Priscilla Grant, Stella Maynard, and Philippa Gordon were both comfort and delight. They studied together, whispered long into the night, and shared joys and worries as only young girls can. Priscilla became Anne's truest companion in this new world, sensible, loyal, and always ready with a quiet word of encouragement. Philippa, or Phil as she liked to be called, was dazzling. With her beauty, charm, and endless laughter, she made friends wherever she went. Yet she turned to Anne often for advice, confessing her doubts and whims, as though Anne's earnestness steadied her. Stella, quieter than the rest, lent a thoughtful balance, her observations gentle but keen. Together, the four formed a sisterhood of sorts, bound by shared dreams and whispered secrets. Anne's letters home were long and detailed. She poured out every thought to Diana Barry, who treasured each word as if it were gold. She told of professors who inspired awe, of classmates who seemed impossibly clever, of moments of homesickness when she longed for the smell of Green Gables wood smoke and the comfort of Marilla's firm voice. Diana's replies were filled with Avonlea news, the antics of the twins, Davy and Dora, the quiet changes in the community, the doings at the Sunday school. Reading them, Anne felt the threads of her old life woven tightly with the new. Matthew, too, insisted on reading every letter. Though he said little, his eyes glowed with pride at Anne's accomplishments. Marilla, practical as ever, nodded with approval, but reminded Anne not to let her imagination run away with her at the expense of her studies. Winter in Charlottetown had its charms. When snow fell thick, the streets turned white and glistening, and sleighs jingled past in merry procession. Anne and her friends went skating on the frozen harbor, their laughter ringing in the cold air. She loved the sharp sting of the wind on her cheeks, the glittering lamps in the frosty dusk, the warmth of hot cocoa afterward. There were evenings of music, too, when students gathered to sing hymns or play the piano. Anne discovered that the shared harmony of voices stirred her soul almost as deeply as poetry. Yet beneath the merriment lay hard work. Examinations loomed, and Anne bent herself to study with fierce determination. She could not forget the hope that burned in her heart, to win a scholarship, to lighten the burden on Marilla and Matthew, and to prove herself worthy of all they had given her. Sometimes, the pressure weighed heavily. There were nights when the numbers in her algebra seemed to dance mockingly on the page, or when her essays refused to take shape. In such moments, discouragement threatened, but Anne, true to her spirit, always rallied. She reminded herself of the orphan girl who had once arrived at Green Gables with nothing but dreams. That girl had come far and would not falter now. Gilbert Blythe was there too, always near, always excelling. The rivalry between him and Anne had not diminished, though it had softened into something less bitter. Each strove to outshine the other, and each secretly admired the other's success. There were times when Anne caught Gilbert watching her with a quiet smile, as though he understood her better than she cared to admit. Though she still remembered their old quarrel, she could not deny that his presence spurred her on. Christmas brought Anne back to Green Gables for a precious few days. The snow lay deep on the fields, the fir trees sparkled with frost, and the farmhouse glowed with warmth. Marilla's welcome was stern but tender, Matthew's smile wordless but full of pride. Anne spent hours talking with Diana, who clung to her as though afraid she might vanish again. They walked the familiar paths, visited the lake of shining waters, and sat by the fire dreaming of the future. To Anne, the visit was like a drink of cool water. After thirst, it refreshed her soul. But soon the holidays ended, and she returned to Queens with renewed purpose. The months of winter pressed on. January brought storms that rattled the windows of the academy. The students huddled in their rooms, poring over books by lamplight. Anne loved these evenings, the hush of falling snow outside, the scratch of pens, the soft companionship of her friends. Sometimes, though, she would pause, gaze out at the white world, and let her imagination wander. She dreamed of writing stories one day, of teaching, of perhaps doing something grand and good in the world. Whatever it was, she knew it would be colored by her love of beauty, by her longing to make life brighter for others. By March, the first hints of spring appeared. The snow melted, streams rushed with clear water, and birds returned. Examinations were drawing near. The air at Queen's grew tense with expectation, and every student felt the weight of what was to come. Anne studied tirelessly, yet she did not let go of her joy. Even in the busiest hours, she found time to pause and marvel at a sunset, or to laugh with her friends. It was this balance, work and wonder, that made her days rich. Thus the winter at Queen's passed a season of labor and growth, of friendship and dreams. Anne Shirley, once the lonely child of Avonlea, had blossomed into a young woman with purpose in her eyes and hope in her heart. And as the snow gave way to blossoms, she stood ready for whatever the future might bring. The spring sun rose earlier now, gilding the towers and red brick walls of Queen's Academy with soft morning light. For weeks, the students had lived with one thought pressing heavily on their minds: examinations. The air buzzed with nervous energy. Pages rustled late into the night, and young faces grew pale with effort. Every classroom, every dormitory, carried the same tension. For Anne Shirley, the days felt like the unfolding of some great story whose ending she had yet to discover. She walked the halls with her head high, books clutched tightly in her arms, her eyes bright with determination. Each morning began early. Anne rose before the others, breathing in the crisp air of April and repeating passages of history or conjugations of Latin verbs under her breath as she dressed. By breakfast, her mind was already racing ahead to the tasks of the day. Her friends felt it too. Priscilla bent over her notes with steady calm. Stella reviewed her mathematics with quiet precision. Philippa, who had once laughed off study as tiresome, now applied herself with surprising vigor. But it was Anne who seemed to glow with an inner fire, as though her whole being was set upon the dream of success. "Anne, you'll wear yourself thin," Priscilla warned one evening, as Anne bent over her desk by lamplight. "I don't care if I do," Anne replied, smiling but weary. Dreams are worth a little wear and tear. Gilbert Blythe was never far from her thoughts. Always, he seemed just a step ahead, his answers sharp, his essays admired by the professors. The rivalry between them burned brighter than ever, though beneath it there was now an unspoken respect. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling recitation, Anne caught sight of Gilbert leaving the classroom. He looked back at her, and for a brief instant, their eyes met. There was no challenge in his gaze, only encouragement, as though he silently said, "We are in this together." It startled Anne. For a moment she almost smiled at him, but pride kept her face composed. Still, the memory lingered, warming her in the days that followed. May arrived, bringing with it blossoms of apple and cherry, their fragrance drifting even into the city streets. The days lengthened, but to the students of Queen's they seemed all too short. The final examinations loomed close, and every hour mattered. Anne studied with relentless focus. She reviewed geometry problems until her head ached. She memorized dates and battles until they marched before her eyes in dreams. Yet even in the midst of such toil, her imagination did not desert her. She told Priscilla that preparing for exams was like climbing a great mountain, painful, exhausting, but with the promise of a glorious view at the summit. At last, the week of trial came. The great hall of Queen's was filled with rows of desks, each bearing paper and ink. Students filed in, pale and trembling, their books left outside, their futures balanced upon what they could remember in those decisive hours. Anne took her seat, her heart pounding. For a moment, doubt threatened her. She thought of Marilla and Matthew waiting at Green Gables, of Diana who believed in her, of every dream she had cherished since childhood. What if she failed them all? Then she lifted her chin, breathed deeply, and steadied her hand. The first paper lay before her. She read the questions once, twice, and suddenly the fear vanished. The answers rose from her memory as if eager to be written. Her pen flew across the page. Hour after hour, examination after examination, Anne poured her heart and mind onto the papers. There were moments of difficulty, an equation that seemed impossible, a passage of Latin that required careful thought, but she did not falter. Each challenge she met with courage, each page filled with her neat, flowing hand. The days passed in a blur. When the final examination ended, Anne walked out into the sunlight, exhausted yet strangely uplifted. The ordeal was over. Now all that remained was to wait. That evening, the students gathered in small groups, whispering over their performances. Some despaired, others boasted. Anne, however, sat quietly with Priscilla, her eyes dreamy. "How do you think you did?" Priscilla asked gently. "I did my best," Anne replied. "And whatever comes, that must be enough." The waiting days were almost worse than the examinations themselves. Each morning Anne awoke with a flutter of nerves, wondering if the results would be posted that day. Each evening she went to bed weary from suspense. At last, the announcement came. A great crowd of students filled the hallway where the list was displayed. Voices buzzed, feet shuffled, hearts beat wildly. Anne pushed her way forward, her breath catching in her throat. There, in neat letters, was her name, Anne Shirley, at the very top of the list, tied only with Gilbert Blythe. For an instant, the world seemed to spin. Then joy flooded her, bright and overwhelming. She turned to Priscilla, eyes shining. "I did it. We did it," she whispered. Gilbert was standing nearby, surrounded by friends congratulating him. Their eyes met once more, and this time Anne did not look away. She smiled, and he smiled back. A silent truce between them. Letters flew home that night. Anne's to Marilla and Matthew was written with trembling hands, words spilling over with gratitude and wonder. Dearest Marilla and Matthew, I have won the Avery Scholarship. I cannot believe it is true. Your faith in me has made this possible. How I long to see Green Gables and tell you everything in person. With all my love, Anne. At Green Gables, Matthew read the letter with eyes misty with pride, while Marilla, though she merely said, "I knew she could," sat quietly afterward with folded hands, her heart full. That evening, Anne walked alone beneath the budding trees of Queen's campus. The air was soft, fragrant with lilac. She thought of the long road that had brought her here from the orphan asylum, from the mistake that had first sent her to Green Gables, from every trial and dream along the way. She had reached the summit of her mountain. She had seen the glory, touched the dream, and yet, as she gazed at the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky, she felt that this was not the end, but only the beginning. For the world was wide, and the future stretched before her like a shining path. And Anne Shirley, with her heart full of hope and her eyes lifted to the heavens, was ready to walk it. June came to Avonlea in a blaze of bloom. The orchards glowed with blossoms, the fields turned greener with each dawn, and the air was sweet with the promise of long summer days. To Anne, everything felt like a hymn: the sky, the grass, the brook's song. The world itself seemed to be praising life, but beneath this brightness, sorrow had already cast its shadow across Green Gables. Marilla had been quieter than usual, her headaches sharp and unyielding, her eyes troubled. And Matthew, dear, gentle Matthew, was not himself either. He moved slowly, his face often pale, and Anne had noticed how he pressed his hand to his heart when he thought no one was looking. Still, life in the village carried on, bustling as always. The new bank had opened in Carmody, and farmers and shopkeepers alike were caught up in the talk of money, credit, and loans. Marilla's savings, carefully set aside over long years, had been placed in that very bank. Matthew, cautious as he was, could not ignore the worry in his mind about what might happen if trouble came. He had read unsettling reports in the paper, and though he said little, Anne could sense the weight on his spirit. One bright morning, news spread quickly across Avonlea. Bank had failed. The whispers turned to sharp exclamations. Farmers clutched their ledgers, shopkeepers paled, and families fretted over savings gone in a single cruel stroke. At Green Gables, Marilla opened the letter that confirmed their loss, and her lips pressed together with grim resolve. "Well, there goes nearly all we've put by," she said flatly. "We'll have to make do with what's left. We'll manage somehow." Anne's heart tightened. She knew the money had been Matthew's particular pride. The harvests stored away, the careful thrift, the quiet satisfaction of a nest egg for the years ahead. That evening, when Anne carried tea into the parlor, she found Matthew sitting alone, the letter spread open before him. His shoulders seemed smaller, as though the paper had borne a weight greater than he could carry. "Matthew," she said softly, "don't worry. We'll manage. We always do." He smiled faintly, his eyes resting on her as if she were the best thing he had ever seen. "You're a good girl, Anne," he murmured. "You're worth more than any bank could hold." She set her cup beside him and laid her hand on his arm. His skin was cool. "Promise me you won't fret yourself sick over this," she pleaded. Matthew nodded, but the shadows in his eyes lingered. The next afternoon was golden and still. Anne was in the garden, tying back roses heavy with bloom, when she heard the slam of the kitchen door. Marilla's voice rang out, sharp and frightened. "Anne, quick! Run, fetch someone. Matthew's down." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Anne flew to the house, her breath ragged, her heart hammering. She found Matthew lying across the threshold of the kitchen, one hand still clutching at his chest, his face ashen. "Matthew! Oh, Matthew!" Anne cried, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice. There was no pain in them now, only a deep, clear light, the look of a soul ready to step beyond. His lips moved faintly. "My girl, my little girl. I'm so proud." His hand trembled against hers, and then it grew still. Anne felt the silence press upon her with unbearable force. The room seemed to stop breathing. Marilla's cry came from behind her, a sound Anne had never heard before, broken, raw, as if it tore itself straight out of the heart. Neighbors were sent for, doctors called, but nothing could change what had happened in that one quiet instant. Matthew Cuthbert, so gentle, so steady, so beloved, had been called home by the reaper whose name is death. The days that followed blurred into grief. The house was filled with quiet footsteps and murmured words of comfort. Yet Anne heard them all as though from far away. She moved through the motions of helping, speaking, thanking, but inside, her world had shattered. Matthew had been more than guardian, more than friend. He had been the first soul to look at her awkward, skinny, unwanted, and see something worth loving. His quiet faith had built her up, brick by brick, until she had become the Anne who could now stand steady in sorrow. She remembered him waiting at the station that first day, hat in hand, smile shy, voice trembling as he said, "Well now, you're here at last." She remembered his pride when she won the Avery Scholarship, his gentle chuckle at her chatter, the way he had always slipped her, the choicest apples, the best books, the tenderest affection, without ever putting it into words. And now, he was gone. Anne wept when she was alone, great sobs that shook her small frame. But when she was with Marilla, she held herself still, for Marilla's grief was even greater. It was as if half of her own life had been cut away, leaving her raw and silent. On the day of the funeral, the Avonlea folk gathered in solemn respect. They spoke kindly of Matthew, his honesty, his gentleness, his quiet goodness. Anne stood by the grave, her hand in Marilla's, and listened to the minister's words float over the headstones and wildflowers. When the earth thudded softly upon the coffin, Anne felt something close within her. But even through the pain, there was gratitude that she had known him, gratitude that his love had been hers. That evening, Anne found herself walking the lane alone, twilight folding softly over the fields. The sky glowed with that tender rose gold light Matthew had always loved. The fir trees whispered in the breeze, and the brook sang on, heedless of sorrow. Anne paused where the lane curved, her heart aching but steady. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice breaking and brave at once. "I'll try to be what you believed I could. I'll carry Green Gables in my heart, and I'll take care of Marilla always." The wind stirred the branches gently, as though in answer. She stood there until the stars appeared, each one a small reminder that though the night had come, light still endured. Anne turned back toward the house, the grief heavy, yes, but no longer hollowing. It had settled into her bones, into her being part of her now, as love was part of her. And she knew, with a certainty as clear as the starlight, that Matthew would walk with her in every step she took. The Reaper had claimed his life, but not his love. That remained, eternal and unbroken. The weeks after Matthew's passing folded gently, like pale linen put away in a cedar chest, kept, cherished, yet tinged with the faint ache of what had been. Green Gables was quieter now. The kitchen clock sounded louder, the kettle's hum softer. Outside, summer unfurled over Avonlea, the clover fields shimmered, and the lake of shining waters moved like a living mirror beneath a silk blue sky. Life went on. It always does. But for Anne and Marilla, each day was touched at the edges by the absence of the man who had loved without loudness. Anne rose earlier than before. She moved through the morning chores with a thoughtful gravity. She learned the comforting arithmetic of habits, how butter must be churned, how linens must be aired, how a house asks for steady kindnesses that add up to a home. She kept a brave face, a gentle humor. She read aloud to Marilla in the evenings, and when she was alone, walked to the hollow where the birches whispered, letting the wind comb through her red hair and carry away the ache she tried not to show. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted gold across the front step, Marilla sat very still, her knitting resting motionless in her lap. Anne, passing through with a basket of fresh-picked peas, paused. Something in the set of Marilla's mouth, the way her eyes narrowed toward the light, made Anne's heart tighten. "Marilla, your head again?" "My eyes," Marilla said quietly. "These headaches, they're not just headaches. The words in my Bible, they blur. Sometimes the print swims so I can't make out a verse I've known since I was 12. She took a breath that trembled. "I must tell you, child, I saw the oculist in Charlottetown last week. He was plain-spoken. If I strain them, if I keep at the sewing, the fine work, the reading by lamplight, I may lose my sight altogether." For a moment, the room seemed to empty of air. Anne set down the basket, peas scattering softly across the table, like small green beads. "Oh, Marilla," she whispered, "it isn't sudden. He says if I rest them, if I stop the work that taxes them, if I wear the heavy glasses he prescribed." She thumbed at them with a grimace. "I may keep what I have, but there's no mending what's worn thin with years." The words fell like slow snow. Anne came and knelt by her chair, folding her hands around Marilla's work-worn fingers. "We'll do whatever we must," she said. "We'll change everything that needs changing." However, Marilla looked at her, truly looked, and for once did not hide the fear that edged her strong, practical soul. "There's more. With Matthew gone, with the bank money lost, Green Gables is too much for me to manage. The farm work, the mending, the bills. I've been thinking perhaps we must sell, perhaps move into Carmody with Mrs. Lynde." She spoke the last name with a mixture of relief and resignation. Rachel Lynde had a hard honesty like a bracing wind, and a loyalty that would not bend. It was as if every bird in the orchard paused mid-flight. "Sell Green Gables." The words carved a hollow in Anne's chest. The white gables, the birch path, the little porch where she dreamed aloud, the place where she had become herself. But she didn't flinch. Love, she had learned, sometimes asked for surrender. "If that's best for you," she said, voice steady, "we'll do it." Marilla's lips trembled. "It breaks my heart. Your future, Redmond scholarships, and the whole world." Anne lifted her head. "Marilla," she said softly, and there was a clear light in her eyes. "I've been thinking too. I can give up the Avery scholarship." Marilla's knitting slid to the floor. "Give up, Anne? No. Your teacher said president of the class, top of Queens, your dreams." "My dreams," Anne said, a small smile touching her mouth, have always been able to bend without breaking. It's their saving virtue. She rose, hands folded, and stood as if she were addressing her jurors hope, duty, and love in equal measure. I can teach. The Avonlea School, that's been promised to Gilbert Blythe, Marilla said carefully. He applied months ago. You know the trustees. Anne's smile faltered. The name stirred an old pride stiff as the starch in Sunday cuffs. Gilbert, who had laughed at her hair and lived to regret the day. Gilbert, who had outpaced her to the Avery Scholarship by only the width of a breath. Gilbert, whose admiring glance at convocations had quivered in the air between them like a moth that has lost its way. Then I could take White Sands, Anne said after a beat. It's a long walk, but I could manage. You could, Marilla allowed. But the point is, should you have to? The next morning, Rachel Lynde arrived with the full authority of friendship and a black bonnet that looked like it could deflect cannon fire. She settled into a kitchen chair as if it had been waiting its whole life to hold her. I've come to talk sense, she announced, though her eyes had already softened at the sight of Marilla's new glasses. First, you'll move to Carmody and live with me, if move you must. Thomas left enough for me to get on, and I've spare rooms. But second, there's something you don't know. She folded her hands, satisfied at having arrived at the heart of her errand. Gilbert Blythe has resigned the Avonlea School. Anne's hand stilled over the bread dough she'd been kneading. Resigned? In favor of you. Mrs. Lynde savored the words as one savors a pie coming out of the oven at precisely the right moment. He had offered to take White Sands, said he would commute, said it would be better for all concerned that Miss Shirley should be near home. The corner of Rachel's mouth twitched, a very ladylike way of stating the obvious. Anne stared at the window, where apple leaves fluttered like small green hands. A warmth rose in her surprise, first, then gratitude, and then something wordless that felt like the untying of a long knot. Gilbert had known. He had chosen kindly, without asking for praise. He had made space for her future to fold neatly beside Marilla's need. Rachel, Marilla began, her voice rough with feeling. That's practical. Cut in. Mark my word. Some boys grow up into men who know what matters. I misliked that lad's grin in church when he was 10, but I've come round. She patted her skirt with finality. So, there it is. The trustees will call on you this afternoon, Anne. Don't simper. Speak up. And for pity's sake, don't let your head turn with nonsense about selling Green Gables until you've tried this arrangement. You'll both do. After she left, the house seemed to glow with a soft astonishment. Anne felt it hum through her, the thing that had begun like a bruise the day Gilbert had called her carrots and had ripened, slowly, into something far more complicated. Not love, not yet. Life is wiser than that. But a friendship she could trust, built of rivalry, respect, and sudden generosity. That evening, as the maples filtered the late light into honey, Anne paused at the gate. She knew who was waiting on the lane. Some part of her had known all afternoon. Gilbert Blythe stood beneath the elm with his hat in his hands. The breeze lifted a strand of dark hair from his forehead. He was no longer the boy she had battled at slates and recitations. He was taller, straighter, and there was something in his face that had learned both loss and patience. "Good evening, Anne," he said, and his voice was steady, kind. "Good evening, Gilbert." She stopped just within reach of the speech she had rehearsed and let it go. The truth would do better. "Thank you." "For what?" he asked lightly, but his eyes had already softened. "For Avonlea," she answered. For understanding. He looked at her, really looked, and then smiled in a way that set the years of childish silliness quietly aside. It's I who should thank you, I think. You made me work for everything I've won. It's a good way to win. She laughed, the sound unlocking like a brook in spring. We've been very foolish, haven't we? All these years wasted not being friends. All the more reason, he said gently, to begin now. His voice held a question, soft as the wind in wheat. Anne held his gaze. Pride had kept them apart. Humility, its unexpected sister, bridged the distance. Yes, she said. Let's begin now. They shook hands, shy as if they were making a pact with the starlight. She felt, in that single, simple touch, not fireworks, but something infinitely steadier, the quiet promise of a companionship that would not hurry the heart, but walk beside it. When she returned to the kitchen, Marilla glanced up. Well, well, Anne said, pouring tea and smiling into the steam. The world is a very interesting place, full of agreeable surprises. The trustees came, blustered, cleared their throats, and offered the school with an air of having invented benevolence. Anne, decorous as a Sunday hymn, accepted. She would teach at Avonlea and live at Green Gables. She and Marilla would try it a year. They would not sell. That night, after the supper dishes were stacked and the house was arranged in its quiet order, Anne carried the lamp upstairs. She paused at the window of her room, green walls, low eaves, the familiar breath of the old house settling into sleep, and lifted the sash. The air flowed in, sweet with clover. Far off, the frogs fiddled in the marsh, and the white way of delight, though only a road with blossoms, looked for a moment like a path to the moon. She thought of scholarships and city spires, of gowns rustling in lecture halls and new faces eager with ideas. She felt a tug, real, earnest, but she felt too the curve of Marilla's hand finding hers in the dusk, the way the kitchen, with its ticking clock and iron kettle, seemed to gather her heart and hold it steady. And she thought of Matthew, his shy smile, his quiet pride, his final words, simple and sure. My girl, I'm so proud. Perhaps, she whispered to the night, this is the best beginning, this quiet, this giving up that isn't really giving up at all. She rested her chin on her hands and smiled, eyes stinging in that happy, sad way that means one has measured something rightly at last. The next days filled with small preparations. Anne and Diana walked the village road in the lavender evenings and planned lessons. Diana's hand tucked into Anne's arm felt exactly as it had always felt, safe, merry, loyal. They talked of frocks and calligraphy pens, of the new school term, and of how strange it was to be almost grown. Do you regret it truly? Diana asked one night, stopping where the birches leaned over the fence as if listening. Redmond. All the grand prospects. Anne traced the pale bark with her fingertips. I thought I might, but I don't. There's a different kind of gladness waiting for me here, one that doesn't rustle and shine so much, but holds fast in the rain. She laughed softly. Besides, who could desert the lake of shining waters? Diana squeezed her arm. You'll be magnificent, Anne Shirley, and someday, when the time is right, the world will still be there. On Sunday, after church, where the hymns felt as though they had been written for hearts, determined to hope, the friends gathered in the yard. The grass, bright as glass. Gilbert lifted a hand in greeting. Anne returned it, her smile open and untroubled. Mrs. Rachel Lynde, observing this from the corner of her sensible eye, permitted herself a small, satisfied sniff. "Things are working out," she said to Marilla as they walked home. "In my experience, they usually do if you work too." Marilla, for once, did not argue. She slid her hand along the fence rail as if it were the edge of a familiar prayer. "Anne is a good girl," she said softly. "Between us and God, we'll make it do." The late summer rolled nearer. Anne cut new white-collar linens, labeled her school books, and corrected a modest little stack of practice compositions for a few pupils who'd been foisted upon her early. She found she loved the work, the neat loops of ink, the way a child's thought could blossom if you watered it with praise and pruned it with a careful question. She discovered, as many teachers do, that the classroom is less a room than a garden, and she knew, as surely as she knew the smell of clover after rain, that she could grow here for now. The evening before the term began, Anne walked alone to the ridge above Green Gables. The world lay like a quilt, the gold squares of stubble, the green patches of pasture, the blue satin of water. She stood for a long time, listening. The wind moved through the grasses in long strokes. The sun was setting in a gown of rose and bronze, and the path home curled out before her, white and clear, then vanished in a soft turn between alders and fern. "The bend in the road," she murmured. "How I used to fear it. Now, I think I'm glad for it." She turned toward home, the hem of her dress whispering over the time. She could not see beyond that bend, none of us can. But she knew, with the luminous certainty that comes only to hearts tempered by love and loss, that there would be more kindness, more beauty, more work, more joy. Perhaps the great dreams would come later. Perhaps they would change shape and call themselves by humbler names. Either way, the road would keep unfolding. At the gate, she paused and looked back the house with its gables white against deepening green. The lane she had walked as a girl, brimming with story. The orchard where laughter had once rung and would ring again. She felt Matthew near, not as a ghost, but as a warmth, steadying, approving. She felt Marilla within, waiting, the lamplight already a small, golden welcome in the window. Anne lifted her chin and smiled. "I don't know what lies around the bend," she said to the soft, listening world, "but I think it will be something good." And with that, she went in to light the lamp. Sometimes the most beautiful road is not the long, straight road, but the one with curves where we are forced to slow down, listen, and choose to love and reconcile right in front of us. True dreams are not lost. They change names, grow with hearts that have known sacrifice. And when we step back around them with faith and gratitude, life often gently opens up another season of light. Thank you for strolling through today's stories with StorySeeker. If you also love classic literature, fairy tales, and endless adventures, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any journey. See you in the next story. Wishing you all the best.